Sometimes the people we overlook are the ones holding the most important pieces of our lives. Silence, invisibility, quiet strength, these don't always come with applause or fame, but they carry a power that breaks walls no riches can build. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're cleaning a kitchen, folding laundry, or coming home from work, staring at the clock after a long day. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will surprise you. This is the story of Maria Elena Gutierrez, a woman who worked as a housekeeper in a gleaming San Francisco mansion where the bay breeze touched glass walls and the echoes of wealth silenced every room. Her hands, calloused but tender, moved with a rhythm known only to those who serve unseen. The sound of a mop gliding over polished marble floors filled the morning hours, accompanied by the quiet ticking of an expensive Swiss clock that no one seemed to listen to anymore. Maria had seen 3 years pass under these impossibly high ceilings, yet her presence was barely a shadow, unnoticed and unappreciated. She carried exhaustion under her dark eyes, but not defeat. There was an unshakable dignity in her steady gaze, like a woman who had endured storms no one ever asked about. Each morning at 5:30, she rode the 24 Divisadero bus from her one-bedroom apartment in the Mission District, watching the city wake up through foggy windows. The Mission was her real world, alive with laughter, color, and the sense of fresh tortillas from La Taqueria and warm pan dulce from Panaderia La Mexicana. Children played soccer in the narrow streets while elderly women sat on stoops, sharing gossip in Spanish and watching over everyone's grandchildren. It was a universe apart from the cold glass fortress perched high in Pacific Heights where she worked. The Davenport mansion sat like a crystal palace against the San Francisco skyline, its modern architecture reflecting nothing but emptiness. Inside, loneliness hovered like the morning fog that rolled in from the Golden Gate Bridge. The rooms were decorated with priceless art and furniture that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, yet they felt hollow, unlived in, like a museum where no one was allowed to touch anything. At the center of this gleaming but barren world was Richard Hamilton Davenport III, a tech entrepreneur whose fortune had been built on a series of brilliant investments in cryptocurrency and biotechnology stocks. His portfolio included millions in Bitcoin, real estate properties spanning from Nob Hill to Marin County, and dividend-yielding assets that generated more passive income in a month than Maria earned in 2 years of careful work. But wealth had not shielded Richard from grief. 3 years earlier, his wife Catherine had died in a car accident on Highway 101, leaving behind a fractured family drowning in silence and misunderstanding. Richard wore his sorrow like an expensive suit, perfectly tailored but suffocating. His broad shoulders, once confident in corporate boardrooms, now carried the weight of a man who had everything money could buy, but had lost what mattered most. The loss had changed him in ways that ran deeper than the gray, threading through his dark hair or the lines etched around his blue eyes. Where once there had been warmth and easy laughter, now there was only the calculated distance of a man who feared loving anything he might lose again. His days were consumed with managing his investment portfolio, checking cryptocurrency prices, and attending board meetings that felt increasingly meaningless. But Richard's greatest challenge and his deepest failure was his relationship with his 10-year-old son, Nathan. The boy was brilliant, gifted with an intelligence that amazed teachers and frustrated therapists in equal measure. Nathan lived with autism, experiencing the world through heightened senses that made ordinary sounds feel like sirens and casual touch feel like lightning. Since his mother's death, he had retreated deeper into a private universe that no expensive specialist or prestigious school seemed able to reach. Nathan spent most of his time in his room on the mansion's 3rd floor, surrounded by hundreds of intricate drawings he created with colored pencils and markers. The pictures were complex, layered compositions that seemed to tell stories in a language only he understood. Geometric patterns intertwined with human faces, while vivid landscapes held tiny figures reaching toward something just beyond the paper's edge. His father hired tutors, therapists, and behavioral specialists, paying premium rates for services that yielded little progress. The boy's world had grown smaller since Catherine's death. She had been his interpreter, the one person who could read the subtle shifts in his posture or the meaning behind his repetitive movements. Without her, Nathan felt lost in translation, watching his father from across an emotional distance that seemed to widen every day. Richard's attempts at connection were clumsy and brief, a pat on the shoulder that made Nathan wince, conversations that died in uncomfortable silence, bedtime stories abandoned when the boy wouldn't make eye contact. Maria had been hired 6 months earlier, not out of faith, but out of desperation. The previous housekeeper had quit after Nathan's meltdown during a dinner party, when the sound of champagne glasses and forced laughter had overwhelmed him. Richard's sister, Victoria, who lived in the mansion's guest wing with her own bitter disappointments, had recommended an agency that specialized in challenging household situations. The morning Maria first walked through the mansion's imposing front gates, she carried more than her cleaning supplies and a thermos of coffee. She carried the weight of her own complicated history, 47 years of life that had taught her about loss, resilience, and the particular strength that comes from being underestimated. Her worn sneakers made soft sounds against the marble entryway as she followed Mrs. Henderson, the stern head housekeeper, through rooms that could have housed 3 families from her neighborhood. Richard barely acknowledged her presence during that first encounter. He was standing in his home office, phone pressed to his ear, discussing a merger that would add several $1 million to his already substantial net worth. Maria caught glimpses of computer screens displaying cryptocurrency charts and stock market analytics, numbers that meant nothing to her but represented the difference between her world and his, a gap measured not just in dollars but in entire universes of experience. Mrs. Henderson's introduction was brief and pointed. "This is Maria. She'll be handling the 3rd floor and assisting with general household duties. I trust you understand that discretion and efficiency are paramount in this position." Maria nodded quietly, her dark eyes taking in details that others missed. The family photographs turned face down on Richard's desk, the thick layer of dust on the piano in the music room, the way Nathan's father stepped sideways to avoid walking past his son's closed bedroom door. From her first day, Maria moved through the mansion like water, present but unobtrusive, essential but invisible. She learned the house's rhythms quickly. Richard left each morning at 7:15 sharp, returning after 7 in the evening to eat dinner alone in the formal dining room while Nathan remained upstairs. Victoria spent her days in the guest wing, emerging only to make sharp comments about household expenses or to criticize the placement of fresh flowers. The other staff members, Mrs. Henderson, the cook Mrs. Chen, and Roberto the groundskeeper, treated Maria with the polite distance reserved for newcomers who might not last. They had seen too many housekeepers come and go, defeated by the mansion's peculiar combination of wealth and sadness. In their eyes, Maria was just another woman from the Mission District who would probably quit within a month when she realized how challenging the Davenport household could be. But Maria possessed something the others had underestimated, a quality forged in the fires of her own difficult past. She had learned to be patient during years of caring for her own mother through Alzheimer's disease, sitting beside a hospital bed in San Francisco General, watching a brilliant woman fade into confusion and silence. She had learned to be observant during her marriage to a man whose love came and went like ocean tides, leaving her to raise their daughter Alejandra mostly alone until cancer took him when the girl was only 12. Most importantly, Maria had learned to see beyond surfaces. Her own struggles with poverty and discrimination had taught her that people's hardest moments often looked like their worst behavior. She recognized pain disguised as anger, fear masquerading as coldness, and love trapped behind walls of grief and misunderstanding. Nathan's world intrigued her from the beginning. During her first week, She noticed how he emerged from his room only during specific hours, always carrying one of his drawings clutched against his chest. He moved through the mansion like a small ghost, avoiding the main hallways where his footsteps might echo, staying close to walls where the shadows offered comfort. When unexpected sounds broke the silence, a door closing, the phone ringing, voices raised in conversation, Nathan would freeze, his hands flying to his ears, his breathing becoming quick and shallow. Maria watched all of this with the patient attention of a woman who understood that important truths revealed themselves slowly. She began to adjust her own routines to accommodate Nathan's patterns. She vacuumed during his scheduled therapy sessions, arranged fresh flowers when he was having lunch, and kept her voice soft during the hours when he was most likely to be in the common areas. The breakthrough came during her third week, on a gray October afternoon, when the San Francisco fog hung low over the mansion's windows like a heavy curtain. Maria was cleaning the hardwood floors in the hallway outside Nathan's room when she heard a sound that made her pause, a soft sobbing that seemed to be coming from behind his closed door. She stood still for several minutes, listening, her heart responding to the universal language of a child in distress. When the crying continued, Maria made a decision that went against every rule of professional distance she had been taught. She knocked gently on Nathan's door, not with the sharp authority of an adult demanding entry, but with the soft rhythm her own mother had used when Maria was small and afraid of thunderstorms. The crying stopped. Maria waited, then knocked again, the same gentle pattern. After a long moment, she heard movement inside the room. The door opened just a crack, revealing one of Nathan's blue eyes, rimmed with tears and filled with a wariness that belonged on a much older face. "Are you okay, mijo?" Maria asked in Spanish, then immediately switched to English. "I heard crying. Sometimes it helps to talk." Nathan didn't respond, but he didn't close the door either. Maria could see past him into the room, which was unlike any child's bedroom she had ever seen. The walls were covered with his drawings, hundreds of them, creating a tapestry of colors and patterns that seemed to pulse with hidden meaning. The pictures were arranged with mathematical precision, not randomly taped up like typical children's art, but organized according to some internal logic that spoke of hours of careful thought. "Those are beautiful pictures," Maria said softly. "Did you make all of them?" Nathan nodded once, his hands still gripping the doorframe. His knuckles were white with tension, but something in Maria's voice seemed to calm him slightly. She crouched down to his eye level, making herself smaller and less threatening. "I used to draw when I was little," she continued. "My favorite thing to draw was my neighborhood in El Salvador, before we came here. Lots of colors, lots of people. Your pictures have so many colors, too." For the first time, Nathan looked directly at her face. The eye contact lasted only a second, but it was enough. In that brief moment, Maria saw intelligence, creativity, and a desperate longing to be understood. She also saw something else, a kind of recognition, as if Nathan sensed that this woman was different from the parade of therapists and tutors who had tried to fix him. "Would you like me to bring you some tea?" Maria asked. "My grandmother used to make me manzanilla tea when I was sad. It tastes like sunshine." Nathan considered this offer with the seriousness of a judge deliberating a court case. Finally, he opened the door a little wider and stepped back, which Maria interpreted as an invitation. She entered his room carefully, moving slowly so as not to startle him, taking in the incredible gallery of artwork that surrounded them. The drawings were even more complex up close. What had seemed like simple pictures from a distance revealed themselves to be layered compositions filled with symbols, patterns, and hidden details. Some showed cityscapes with impossible architecture where buildings bent and twisted like living things. Others depicted forests where every tree was made of geometric shapes, with small figures hiding among the branches. Still others were portraits, faces that seemed familiar but slightly wrong, as if Nathan was trying to capture something about people that couldn't be expressed with conventional features. "These are amazing," Maria said, meaning it completely. "You see things differently than other people do." Nathan followed her gaze to a particularly intricate drawing that showed what looked like the mansion's interior, but with walls that were transparent and rooms that existed inside other rooms. Small figures moved through the space, recognizable as family members, but transformed into something more symbolic than realistic. "Is that your family?" Maria asked gently. Nathan nodded. In the drawing, the figure that represented his father was surrounded by geometric barriers, isolated in what looked like a glass box. The figure representing himself was shown in multiple places simultaneously, sometimes visible, sometimes fading, always reaching toward other figures who seemed unaware of his presence. "It must be hard when people don't understand what you're trying to tell them," Maria observed. Nathan's response was to pick up a colored pencil and begin adding details to the corner of a nearby drawing. Maria watched as he worked, noticing the precise way he held the pencil, the careful pressure he applied to create different shades and textures. His movements were economical and purposeful, like those of an artist who had been drawing for decades rather than a 10-year-old boy. Maria made the tea in Nathan's small kitchen area, a space that had been added to his room to help him maintain independence. As the manzanilla steeped, filling the room with its gentle herbal fragrance, she continued to study his artwork. Patterns began to emerge, visual themes that repeated across multiple drawings. There were recurring symbols, spirals that might represent confusion, bridges that led nowhere, hands reaching across empty spaces. Most significantly, there were representations of doors, always closed, always heavy-looking, as if they required tremendous effort to open. While they sipped tea together in companionable silence, Maria began to understand that Nathan's drawings were not just art, they were communication. Each picture was an attempt to express experiences and emotions that had no place in ordinary language. The overwhelming sensory world he lived in, the isolation he felt within his own family, the complex relationships between his internal experience and external reality, all of it was documented in vivid color and careful detail. "Your pictures tell stories," Maria said eventually. "Important stories that people need to hear." Nathan looked at her with surprise, as if no one had ever said anything like this to him before. He reached for a drawing that had been sitting face down on his desk and turned it over carefully. This one was different from the others, simpler in composition, but more emotional in content. It showed a small figure standing at a window, looking out at a world filled with bright colors and movement. The figure's reflection in the window showed not his external appearance, but his internal state, a complex mandala of interconnected patterns that seemed to represent the rich inner life hidden behind his quiet exterior. "That's beautiful," Maria whispered. "That's you, isn't it? The real you." Nathan nodded, and for the second time that afternoon, he made eye contact with her. This time it lasted longer, long enough for Maria to see tears gathering in his blue eyes. "Mijo," she said softly, using the Spanish endearment that had slipped out naturally. "You are not broken. You are not wrong. You just speak a different language than other people." The words seemed to release something in Nathan. He began pulling out drawing after drawing, showing Maria images that he had apparently never shared with anyone else. There were pictures of his mother, not realistic portraits, but symbolic representations that captured her essence in ways that photographs could not. One showed her as a tree whose roots intertwined with the foundations of the house, whose branches reached protectively toward a small bird that clearly represented Nathan himself. There were pictures of his father too, but these were more complicated. Some showed Richard as a figure made of ice, beautiful but untouchable. Others depicted him as a lighthouse, casting beams of light but standing isolated on a rocky shore. In one particularly moving drawing, Richard was shown as a puzzle with several pieces missing, while Nathan appeared as one of the missing pieces, floating nearby but unable to find his proper place in the picture. As the afternoon wore on, Maria found herself drawn deeper into Nathan's visual world. His art revealed layers of understanding about his family that the adults around him seemed to have missed entirely. He knew his father was in pain. He knew his Aunt Victoria was angry about something that had nothing to do with him. He knew Mrs. Henderson was tired and overworked. He knew the house itself was grieving. Most importantly, his pictures showed a child who was desperately trying to connect with the people around him using the only language he truly mastered. But no one had learned to speak that language back to him. When Richard returned home that evening, he found Maria and Nathan in the kitchen together, sharing a simple dinner of quesadillas and fruit. It was the first time in months that Nathan had eaten anywhere other than his room. The boy was animated in a way his father rarely saw, showing Maria how to fold the tortilla properly and explaining in his careful way why the cheese needed to be distributed evenly for optimal flavor. Richard stood in the doorway, unseen, watching this domestic scene with conflicted emotions. Part of him was relieved to see Nathan engaged and apparently happy. But another part felt threatened by this woman's easy success, where he had failed so completely. Who was she to waltz into their lives and immediately form a connection that had eluded him for years? "Nathan," Richard said, his voice perhaps sharper than he intended, "you should be eating in the dining room. That's what tables are for." Nathan's animation disappeared instantly. He pushed his plate away and slid down from his chair, avoiding his father's gaze as he prepared to retreat to his room. But Maria placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Mr. Davenport," she said, her voice respectful but steady. "Nathan was showing me his drawings. He's very talented. Maybe you'd like to see them too." Richard's expression tightened. Nathan needs to focus on his therapy assignments, not waste time on scribbling. Dr. Morrison was very clear about establishing structured routines. The words fell into the kitchen like stones into still water, creating ripples of tension that seemed to push everyone further apart. Nathan's shoulders hunched forward, and Maria felt his whole body tense beside her. "With respect, Mr. Davenport," Maria said carefully, "sometimes art is therapy too. Nathan's pictures show how he sees the world. They're not just scribbles." But Richard was already turning away, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the marble floor as he headed toward his study. "Please make sure Nathan finishes his dinner in the appropriate location," he called over his shoulder. "And Maria, in the future, it would be best if you focused on your assigned duties." The kitchen fell silent except for the humming of the refrigerator and the distant sound of foghorns from the bay. Nathan stood with his head down, his hands beginning to flutter at his sides in the repetitive motion that appeared when he was overwhelmed. Maria recognized the signs of an approaching meltdown and moved quickly to prevent it. "Come on, mijo," she said softly, gathering his plate and cup. "Let's go finish eating in your room. We can look at more of your pictures while we eat." As they climbed the stairs together, Maria felt the weight of Richard's rejection settling over the house like the evening fog. She was beginning to understand that Nathan's isolation was not just a result of his autism, it was also a consequence of a family system that had broken down under the weight of grief and fear. Richard's love for his son was apparent, but it was buried beneath layers of frustration, guilt, and the terrible helplessness that comes from not knowing how to help someone you care about. That night, after Nathan had fallen asleep surrounded by his drawings, Maria sat in the staff quarters thinking about the day's events. She had been hired to clean and organize, to maintain the physical spaces of the Davenport mansion. But she was beginning to realize that the real mess in this house was not dust or clutter. It was the broken connections between people who loved each other, but had forgotten how to communicate. She thought about her own daughter, Alejandra, now 28 and working as a nurse in Los Angeles. During the difficult years after her husband's death, when money was scarce and grief felt overwhelming, Maria had sometimes failed to understand what Alejandra needed. There had been arguments, misunderstandings, periods of painful distance, but they had fought their way back to each other through patience, forgiveness, and the gradual recognition that love alone was not always enough. You also needed to learn how to express that love in ways the other person could receive. Looking around the mansion's gleaming surfaces and expensive furnishings, Maria realized that Richard had never had to learn those lessons. His wealth had always allowed him to buy solutions rather than develop them, to hire expertise rather than cultivate understanding. But Nathan's needs couldn't be purchased. They could only be met through the kind of patient, attentive care that required seeing him as he truly was rather than as a problem to be solved. As she prepared for sleep, Maria made a quiet promise to herself. She would continue to do her assigned job with the same professionalism and attention to detail that she brought to everything. But she would also do something more. She would be present for Nathan in the ways that his family seemed unable to manage, not because it was part of her official duties, but because it was part of her nature to nurture, to protect, to help souls find their way home to wholeness. Outside her window, the lights of San Francisco twinkled like stars scattered across the darkness. Somewhere in the Mission District, her neighbors were ending their own difficult days, preparing for sleep in apartments much smaller than the room she occupied. But Maria felt a familiar sense of purpose settling over her. The same feeling she had experienced as a young mother, as a caregiver for her own aging parents, as a woman who had learned that sometimes the most important work happened in quiet moments when no one was watching. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, she knew. Richard's defensiveness would probably increase rather than decrease. The other staff members would continue to watch her with cautious curiosity. Nathan would need ongoing patience and understanding as he learned to trust that this new adult in his life would not disappear or reject him like so many others had. But Maria had survived harder things than wealthy people's emotional problems. She had crossed borders, buried loved ones, raised a child while working multiple jobs, and maintained her faith in humanity despite experiencing plenty of evidence that the world could be cruel and unfair. A grieving millionaire and his misunderstood son were not beyond her capacity to help, especially if she could convince them to start helping each other. As she drifted off to sleep, Maria found herself thinking about Nathan's drawings, particularly the one that showed his father as a lighthouse. The image suggested that Richard was not truly cold or uncaring. He was just isolated, casting his light in all directions but standing alone on his rocky shore. The boy understood this, even if he couldn't express it in words. Perhaps Maria's job was not to fix the relationship between father and son, but simply to help them see what Nathan's art had already revealed, that they were both looking for the same thing, just from different vantage points. The fog rolled in thick that night, wrapping the mansion in its customary embrace. But inside the building, small changes were already taking root. In Nathan's room, his newest drawing lay open on his desk, a picture of 3 figures sitting around a table, sharing food and conversation. One figure was small and precise, clearly representing himself. Another was tall and gentle, wearing the simple clothes of a working woman. The third was larger and more shadowy, standing slightly apart from the table, but leaning forward as if listening to something important. For the first time in any of Nathan's pictures, all the doors were open. Maria's second week in the Davenport household began with what Mrs. Henderson diplomatically referred to as an incident. Victoria Davenport Hayes had discovered that Maria had rearranged some items in the guest wing during regular cleaning, moving a vase of flowers from the windowsill to the coffee table to better accommodate the morning light. It was a small adjustment, the kind an experienced housekeeper makes instinctively to enhance a room's beauty. But Victoria interpreted it as presumption. "This woman thinks she can redecorate my living space," Victoria announced to Mrs. Henderson in the kitchen, her voice carrying the particular sharpness of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I don't care what qualified her for this position, but she clearly doesn't understand boundaries." Maria overheard this conversation while she was organizing the pantry nearby. She said nothing, continuing to arrange canned goods with methodical precision, but her hands moved a little more slowly as she absorbed yet another criticism. Victoria's complaints were becoming a daily occurrence. The coffee was too weak, the newspapers weren't folded properly, the vacuum cleaner had been used during her preferred reading hours. Mrs. Henderson, to her credit, had begun defending Maria's work. "She's actually very thorough," the head housekeeper said. "The house hasn't been this clean since—" She stopped herself before mentioning Catherine's death, but the unfinished sentence hung in the air like incense. Victoria's bitterness had roots that went deeper than housekeeping disputes. At 55, she was Richard's older sister, a woman whose own marriage had ended in public scandal and financial ruin 5 years earlier. Her ex-husband, a prominent San Francisco attorney, had been caught embezzling client funds to cover gambling debts. The divorce had been ugly, leaving Victoria with a modest settlement, a damaged reputation, and the bitter knowledge that she was now dependent on her younger brother's generosity for her comfortable lifestyle. Living in Richard's guest wing was a constant reminder of her reduced circumstances. She had once owned a penthouse in Russian Hill, entertained senators and tech moguls, and served on the boards of prestigious charities. Now she spent her days reading mystery novels and finding fault with the hired help, using criticism as a way to maintain some sense of control over her changed situation. Maria understood this dynamic better than Victoria realized. She had worked for enough wealthy families to recognize the signs of displaced anger and wounded pride. Victoria's complaints weren't really about flower vases or vacuum cleaner timing. They were about a woman trying to maintain dignity in circumstances she found humiliating. So Maria absorbed the criticisms quietly, making small adjustments to her routines to accommodate Victoria's preferences where possible. She began cleaning the guest wing during Victoria's morning walks, folded newspapers differently, and moved flower arrangements back to their original positions. It was easier to adapt than to argue, and Maria had learned long ago that battles over small things usually masked wars over larger ones. But Victoria's hostility escalated when she discovered that Maria had been spending time with Nathan. The turning point came on a Friday afternoon when Victoria returned early from a hairdresser appointment and found Maria and Nathan in the mansion's library, working together on one of his drawings. Nathan was explaining the symbolism in his latest creation, while Maria listened with genuine interest, occasionally asking questions that prompted him to elaborate further. "What exactly is going on here?" Victoria demanded from the doorway, her freshly styled silver hair gleaming under the library's recessed lighting. Nathan immediately went silent, his hands moving to his ears in the protective gesture that had become familiar to Maria. She stood up slowly, positioning herself slightly in front of the boy. "Nathan was showing me his artwork," Maria said calmly. "He's very talented." "Nathan has scheduled therapy sessions and educational activities," Victoria replied sharply. "He doesn't need encouragement from the domestic staff to waste time on these obsessive behaviors." The word obsessive hit Nathan like a slap. Maria watched his face crumple and his breathing become shallow. She had seen this reaction before, when adults dismissed his art as symptoms rather than communication. "Mrs. Hayes," Maria said, her voice still respectful but firmer than before. "Nathan's drawings are not obsessive behaviors. They're how he expresses himself. Look at the detail, the planning, the emotional content." "I don't need a lecture from the help about child psychology," Victoria interrupted. "Nathan, go to your room immediately. Maria, please return to your actual responsibilities." Nathan fled without a word, leaving his drawings scattered across the library table. Maria began gathering them carefully, her movements deliberate and controlled. But Victoria was not finished. "Let me be very clear about something," she continued, her voice dropping to a tone that was somehow both quiet and threatening. "This family has been through enough disruption. Nathan needs structure and professional guidance, not indulgence from someone who doesn't understand his condition. If you continue to interfere with his treatment plan, I'll have no choice but to recommend your immediate termination." Maria looked up from the drawings she was collecting, her dark eyes meeting Victoria's blue ones directly for the first time. In that moment, Victoria saw something that made her take an involuntary step backward, not defiance exactly, but a kind of quiet strength that suggested this woman from the Mission District was not as easily intimidated as she had assumed. "I understand, Mrs. Hayes," Maria said simply. Then she left the library, carrying Nathan's artwork with the same care she might carry sacred objects. That evening, Maria found herself on the mansion's service balcony during her dinner break, looking out over the San Francisco Bay as the sun set behind the Golden Gate Bridge. The view was spectacular, something that would cost millions to purchase, but it felt hollow without human warmth to give it meaning. She thought about her small apartment in the Mission, where the windows faced the neighbor's wall and the only view was of hanging laundry and fire escapes. But when Alejandra called from Los Angeles, or when her neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez invited her for Sunday dinner, that cramped space felt infinitely more welcoming than this palace of isolation. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Alejandra. "How's the new job, Mommy? Still think rich people have it easier?" Maria smiled despite her troubled mood. Her daughter had always been skeptical of her mother's empathy for wealthy clients, arguing that people with unlimited resources had no excuse for being miserable. But Alejandra worked in pediatric oncology, where she saw every day how money could not purchase the things that mattered most: time, health, love, peace. "Complicated," Maria texted back. "Money can buy treatment but not understanding. This family needs healing more than housekeeping." "Be careful, Mommy," came the quick reply. "Don't let them break your heart again." The warning was accurate. Maria had a history of becoming too emotionally invested in her employers' lives, a tendency that had sometimes led to disappointment when her care was not reciprocated. But she also knew that her willingness to see beyond surfaces, to treat each person as fully human regardless of their behavior, was not a weakness to be overcome. It was a gift to be used wisely. The next morning brought an unexpected development. Richard appeared in the kitchen while Maria was preparing Nathan's breakfast, something that rarely happened since he usually left for his downtown office before 8. He stood in the doorway for several moments, watching her work with apparent uncertainty about how to begin a conversation. "Mrs. Henderson tells me you've been spending time with Nathan," he said eventually. Maria continued buttering toast with steady motions. "Yes, Mr. Davenport, during my breaks, sometimes after my work is finished for the day. I hope that's acceptable." "My sister seems to think you're interfering with his treatment program." Now Maria looked up, trying to read the expression on Richard's face. He seemed more tired than angry, as if the conversation with Victoria had been as unpleasant for him as it had been for everyone else. "Nathan shows me his artwork," Maria said carefully. "We talk about colors and shapes. I ask questions about what the pictures mean to him. I don't think that interferes with anything." Richard moved further into the kitchen, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking against the tile floor. He was wearing a navy blue suit that probably cost more than Maria earned in a month, but she noticed that it hung loosely on his frame as if he had lost weight recently. "Dr. Morrison says Nathan needs consistent boundaries and structured activities. Too much flexibility can be overwhelming for children with his condition." "Of course," Maria agreed. "Structure is important, but so is feeling understood and valued for who you are." The words seemed to catch Richard off guard. He stood quietly for a moment, perhaps considering whether this housekeeper was overstepping her bounds by offering opinions about his son's needs. But instead of reprimanding her, he did something unexpected. "What do you think about when you look at his drawings?" he asked. The question was so direct, so unlike their previous formal interactions, that Maria paused in her breakfast preparations. She could sense that her answer mattered, that Richard was asking not as an employer testing an employee's knowledge, but as a father genuinely trying to understand his child. "I think he sees things the rest of us miss," Maria said slowly. "He notices patterns and connections that aren't obvious to other people. His pictures show how complicated feelings can be. Love and fear mixed together, wanting to connect but being afraid of getting hurt. He draws what it feels like to be misunderstood." Richard's expression shifted slightly, a crack appearing in the composed mask he usually wore. "That sounds like you're saying he's sad." "Not sad exactly," Maria replied. "More like lonely, but also hopeful. His pictures show someone who believes that other people could understand him if they learned how to look." They stood in silence for several minutes, both focusing on Nathan's breakfast, as if it required their complete concentration. Finally, Richard spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "I don't know how to talk to him anymore. Since Catherine died, it's like he's speaking a foreign language and I've forgotten how to translate." The admission was so honest, so vulnerable, that Maria felt her protective instincts shift, to include this grieving man as well as his son. She recognized the particular pain of a parent who loves deeply but fears they are failing anyway. "Maybe the language isn't as foreign as you think," she said gently. "Maybe it just takes practice to remember how to speak it." Richard looked directly at her then, and for a moment she saw past the expensive suits and the cryptocurrency portfolios to the exhausted father underneath. "Would you," he began, then stopped, seeming to reconsider. "Nathan seems comfortable with you, more comfortable than he's been with anyone since his mother died. If you're willing, maybe you could help me understand what I'm missing." The request hung between them like a bridge that neither was sure was safe to cross. Maria understood that accepting would mean taking on responsibilities far beyond her job description, potentially putting herself in the middle of family dynamics that could become complicated. But she also knew that Nathan was listening from somewhere upstairs, probably with his ear pressed to the heating vent that connected the kitchen to his room. Hoping that the adults in his life might finally find a way to help each other help him. "I'd be honored to help," Maria said simply. That afternoon, for the first time since Maria's arrival, the three of them sat together in Nathan's room while he explained his latest drawing. The picture showed the mansion as a kind of spaceship, floating through a starry sky filled with mathematical equations and musical notes. The figures inside the spaceship were no longer trapped behind glass walls as they had been in earlier drawings. Instead, they were gathered around what looked like a control panel, working together to navigate toward a bright planet that gleamed with possibility. "Are we traveling somewhere?" Richard asked, studying the image with new attention. Nathan nodded enthusiastically. "To a place where everyone speaks the same language," he said, the longest sentence Maria had heard him speak to his father in weeks. "What language is that?" Richard continued, apparently unaware that he was having the most substantive conversation with his son in months. "Pictures," Nathan replied, "and feelings and colors that match the inside of things." Maria watched Richard's face as he processed this explanation. She could see him struggling to understand, but also making a genuine effort to engage with Nathan's unique way of expressing himself. It was a small beginning, fragile and uncertain, but it was movement in the right direction. The session was interrupted by Victoria's appearance at Nathan's door. She took in the scene, Richard sitting on the floor looking at drawings, Nathan animated and engaged, Maria serving as interpreter and guide, and her expression hardened. "Richard, you have a conference call with Tokyo in 10 minutes, she announced. "I'll call them back," Richard replied without looking away from Nathan's artwork. "It's about the Yamamoto cryptocurrency acquisition. You can't reschedule that kind of meeting." Richard's shoulders tightened with frustration, but he stood up reluctantly. "We'll continue this later," he told Nathan, but the boy had already begun to withdraw into himself, sensing that the brief moment of connection was ending. After Richard left, Victoria remained in the doorway, her gaze fixed on Maria with unmistakable hostility. "I suppose you think you're very clever," she said quietly, ensuring that Nathan couldn't hear. "Playing the helpful saint, making Richard think you're some kind of child whisperer." "I'm just trying to help," Maria replied, beginning to gather up the drawings that were still scattered around Nathan's desk. "Help yourself to a permanent position, you mean? Let me tell you something about this family. We don't need saving, especially not by someone who cleans toilets for a living. Richard may be temporarily grateful for your amateur psychology, but that won't last. And when he comes to his senses, you'll be out on the street where you belong." Victoria's words were designed to wound, and they succeeded. But Maria had heard similar attacks before from other employers who felt threatened by her competence or uncomfortable with her dignity. She had learned to let the poison pass through her without letting it take root in her heart. "I understand you're concerned about Nathan and your brother," Maria said evenly. "We all want what's best for them." "Don't pretend we're on the same side," Victoria snapped. "You're here temporarily, taking advantage of a grieving family's vulnerability. But this isn't a telenovela where the humble maid wins over the rich family with her pure heart. This is real life. And in real life, people like you get replaced as soon as people like us remember who we really are." With that, Victoria turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor like exclamation points to her threats. Maria continued organizing Nathan's art supplies, her hands steady despite the attack. But her mind was troubled. She recognized truth in Victoria's warnings, even if they were delivered with cruelty. She was taking risks by becoming involved in this family's emotional healing, potentially setting herself up for disappointment or worse. But when she looked at Nathan, who was now working quietly on a new drawing that showed three figures standing together under a rainbow that seemed to emerge from their shared conversation, Maria knew she could not pull back now. Whatever the personal cost, this boy needed someone who believed in his intelligence, his sensitivity, and his fundamental worth as a human being. That evening, as Maria prepared for the long bus ride back to the Mission District, she reflected on the day's events. Progress had been made, genuine, significant progress. Richard had taken the first steps toward understanding his son's unique way of communicating. Nathan had experienced what it felt like to have two adults pay careful attention to his thoughts and feelings. Even Victoria's hostility could be seen as evidence that the household's established patterns were shifting in ways that made some people uncomfortable. But Maria also understood that sustainable change would require more than a few good conversations. Richard would need to consistently prioritize his relationship with Nathan over his business obligations. Nathan would need ongoing support as he learned to trust that his father's attention would not disappear again. And Victoria's resistance would likely intensify as she felt more threatened by the growing bond between her brother and his son. Most challenging of all, Maria would need to find ways to help this family without losing herself in their problems. She had learned from past experience that her tendency to give everything to others could leave her depleted and ultimately less useful to the people she was trying to help. The art would be finding the balance between caring deeply and maintaining the boundaries necessary for long-term effectiveness. As her bus wound through the evening traffic toward her own neighborhood, Maria found herself thinking about her daughter's text message warning. Alejandra was right to be concerned. Rich people's problems were not necessarily more important than poor people's problems, and Maria had limited energy to spend on healing the world's wounded hearts. But Nathan was not just any rich person's child. He was a boy experiencing the particular kind of suffering that comes from being fundamentally misunderstood by the people who love you most. If Maria could help bridge that gap, if she could contribute to creating a home where Nathan felt truly seen and valued, then the risk of disappointment seemed worth taking. Not because the Davenports deserved her care more than anyone else, but because she was uniquely positioned to provide something they desperately needed and could not purchase anywhere else: the patient, attentive love of someone who understood both strength and vulnerability from personal experience. The bus carried her through the familiar streets of her own world, past the corner markets with hand-painted signs, the Iglesia San Carlos where she attended Mass on Sunday mornings, the community center where local children took ESL classes and senior citizens played dominoes. This was where she belonged, where her roots ran deep and her contributions were appreciated rather than questioned. But tomorrow she would return to the mansion in Pacific Heights, carrying with her the conviction that healing was possible even in places where wealth had created walls instead of windows. Nathan's drawings had shown her glimpses of a different future for the Davenport family, one where isolation gave way to connection, where fear was replaced by understanding, where love finally found ways to express itself across the differences that had kept them apart. It would not be easy work, and success was far from guaranteed. But Maria had been doing impossible things her entire life. One more seemed manageable, especially when success would mean helping a brilliant, sensitive boy find his way home to wholeness and belonging. 3 weeks later, the fragile progress that had begun between Richard and Nathan was tested by what Mrs. Chen would later describe as the worst Thursday in mansion history. The day began with Nathan having a severe meltdown during his morning routine, triggered by an unexpected change in his therapy schedule. Dr. Morrison had called to reschedule his weekly session, disrupting the careful sequence of activities that helped Nathan feel secure and grounded. When changes to his schedule occurred without warning, Nathan's neurological system went into what looked like chaos, but was actually an overwhelmed child's attempt to regain control through the only methods available to him. He threw his breakfast across the kitchen, swept his art supplies off his desk, and retreated under his bed where he rocked back and forth while making sounds that indicated extreme distress. Richard, who had been planning to spend the morning working with Nathan on understanding his drawings, instead found himself dealing with a crisis he felt completely unprepared to handle. His first instinct was to call Dr. Morrison for guidance, but the therapist was in surgery and unavailable. Mrs. Henderson suggested they contact the backup specialist, but Nathan became more agitated when strangers' names were mentioned. It was Maria who found the solution, arriving for her shift to discover the household in turmoil. She took one look at Nathan's fetal position under the bed and immediately understood what was needed. Without asking permission, she began humming a gentle melody while she slowly approached his hiding place. "Mijo," she whispered in Spanish, then translated to English. "It's okay, baby. I know everything feels too much right now. You're safe. I'm here." Nathan's rocking slowed slightly. Maria continued humming while she carefully sat on the floor near the bed, making herself small and non-threatening. Gradually, she began incorporating Spanish words into her English, creating a bilingual lullaby that seemed to cut through Nathan's panic in ways that purely English communication could not. "Tranquilo, mi niño. Easy, sweet boy. Todo va a estar bien. Everything is going to be okay." After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, Nathan's breathing began to regulate. Maria continued her gentle singing while Richard watched from the doorway. Amazed by this woman's ability to reach his son in a state where everyone else had failed. Eventually, Nathan emerged from under the bed, his face streaked with tears, but his body no longer rigid with stress. Maria opened her arms and he collapsed into her embrace, allowing himself to be comforted in a way he rarely permitted with anyone else. "What happened, mijo?" Maria asked softly. "Can you tell me about the big feelings?" "Too many changes," Nathan whispered against her shoulder. "Dr. Morrison isn't coming. The schedule is wrong. Everything is broken." "Changes are hard," Maria agreed, "but broken things can be fixed, and sometimes when we fix them, they end up even better than before." Richard stepped forward hesitantly. "Nathan, I'm sorry the schedule got changed. I know how much that bothers you. What can we do to make today feel better?" It was the right question, asked with genuine concern rather than frustration. Nathan looked up from Maria's shoulder to consider his father's face, evaluating whether this offer of control was real or just adult manipulation. Can we work on the spaceship picture?" Nathan asked carefully. "The one where everyone learns to talk to each other?" "Yes," Richard said immediately. "We can work on it as long as you want." What followed was the most productive 3 hours Richard and Nathan had spent together since Catherine's death. With Maria serving as interpreter when communication became difficult, father and son collaborated on expanding Nathan's drawing into something approaching a graphic novel. Nathan provided the visual concepts, while Richard asked questions that helped develop the story's narrative structure. The spaceship metaphor became a framework for discussing the family's real-life situation. The mathematical equations floating through space represented the logical thinking that Richard valued. The musical notes symbolized the emotional expression that Nathan needed. The bright planet they were traveling toward became a place where both approaches were valued equally. In the spaceship story, Nathan explained while adding new details to his drawing, the captain has to learn that the navigation system needs both numbers and songs to work properly. If he only uses numbers, the ship gets lost in space. If he only uses songs, the ship crashes into asteroids. Richard realized, with something approaching shock, that his 10-year-old son was using elaborate visual metaphors to explain complex ideas about family dynamics and emotional intelligence. The boy he had dismissed as difficult or challenging was actually a sophisticated thinker whose insights often surpassed those of the expensive therapists they had been consulting. So the captain needs both the mathematician and the musician, Richard said slowly, testing his understanding of Nathan's symbolism. Yes, but he also needs to listen to both of them with the same kind of attention, Nathan replied. Sometimes grown-ups pretend to listen to feelings, but they're really trying to change them into numbers. The accuracy of this observation was so startling that Richard fell silent for several minutes. He recognized himself in Nathan's description, the father who asked about emotions but immediately tried to solve them rather than simply acknowledging their validity. Maria watched this exchange with growing hope. She could see Richard genuinely grappling with concepts that challenged his fundamental assumptions about how families should operate. The corporate mindset that served him well in business, identify problems quickly, implement solutions efficiently, measure results objectively, was not only unhelpful in parenting Nathan, but actively counterproductive. What else does the captain need to learn? Richard asked, apparently committed to following Nathan's metaphor wherever it led. That sometimes the best discoveries happen when you get lost, Nathan replied seriously. If you never leave the flight plan, you never find the planets that aren't on the maps yet. This statement hung in the air between them like a revelation. Richard looked at his son with new eyes, beginning to understand that Nathan's autism was not just a collection of deficits to be managed, but also a different way of perceiving reality that might offer insights unavailable to neurotypical thinking. The afternoon's breakthrough seemed to create momentum for further progress. Over the following days, Richard began incorporating Nathan's suggestions into their daily routines. Instead of rigid schedules imposed from above, they developed flexible frameworks that accommodated both structure and spontaneity. Instead of dismissing Nathan's intense interests as obsessions, Richard learned to see them as windows into his son's complex inner world. But their progress did not go unnoticed by other household members, and not all of the attention was positive. Victoria's resentment toward Maria had been simmering since the library incident, fed by her growing sense that this housekeeper was assuming inappropriate authority within the family. The sight of Richard, Nathan, and Maria working together like some kind of collaborative unit triggered her deepest insecurities about her own relevance and value. The confrontation came during Maria's third month on the job, on a rainy February afternoon when the San Francisco fog hung so thick that the mansion felt completely isolated from the outside world. Victoria had been watching Maria closely for weeks, looking for evidence of overreach or unprofessional behavior. She found her opportunity when she discovered Maria in Richard's study, using his computer to research therapeutic approaches for children with autism. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Victoria demanded, her voice sharp with accusation. Maria looked up from the screen, where she had been reading about art therapy techniques that might complement Nathan's existing treatment plan. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hayes. Mr. Davenport said I could use the computer to research programs that might help Nathan. I can ask him again if you—" "You what?" Victoria interrupted. "Richard gave you permission to access his private computer, to conduct your own research into Nathan's condition?" "He wanted me to look up some of the therapy approaches we discussed," Maria explained calmly. "I was trying to find information about whether Nathan's artwork could be integrated into his treatment sessions with Dr. Morrison." Victoria's face flushed with anger. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. You've completely overstepped your boundaries. You're the housekeeper, not a member of this family. You don't get to make decisions about Nathan's treatment, and you certainly don't get to give Richard parenting advice." Maria saved the research she had been doing and began to close the computer, moving slowly to avoid escalating the confrontation. But Victoria was not finished. "I've been watching you manipulate this situation from the beginning," she continued, her voice rising. "Playing the saint, positioning yourself as the only person who truly understands Nathan. Well, I see right through your act. You're trying to make yourself indispensable so you can secure your position here permanently." "That's not true," Maria said quietly. "I care about Nathan. I want to help him succeed." "You care about your paycheck," Victoria shot back. "And you've figured out that playing amateur therapist is more interesting than scrubbing floors. But let me remind you of something. I've seen women like you before. Women who think they can charm their way into families that don't belong to them. It never ends well. The personal attack pushed the confrontation into more dangerous territory. Victoria's words were designed not just to criticize Maria's professional conduct, but to attack her character and motivations. It was the kind of accusation that could damage reputations and end careers, especially for domestic workers whose livelihoods depended on recommendations and trust. "Mrs. Hayes," Maria said, her voice still controlled but firmer than before, "I understand you're concerned about Nathan and your brother, but I'm not trying to replace anyone or take anything that doesn't belong to me. I'm just trying to do my job well. Your job is to clean this house, not to psychoanalyze its inhabitants," Victoria replied coldly. "And if you think Richard's temporary gratitude gives you some kind of permanent status here, you're sadly mistaken. Men like my brother don't form lasting attachments to women like you. When this novelty wears off, you'll be discarded like all the other help who got too comfortable." The words hit their intended target. Maria understood Victoria's implicit message that any connection she had formed with Richard and Nathan was temporary, based on convenience rather than genuine appreciation. It was a reminder of the fundamental power imbalance that existed between employers and employees, no matter how friendly or collaborative the relationship might appear on the surface. But Victoria was not satisfied with landing emotional blows. She had decided that Maria's influence on the family needed to be permanently eliminated, and she was prepared to escalate her campaign to achieve that goal. "I'm going to speak with Richard tonight," Victoria announced. "It's time he understood what's really happening here. You've been filling Nathan's head with inappropriate ideas about his condition, encouraging him to see his autism as some kind of gift rather than a disability that needs treatment. You've undermined Dr. Morrison's authority by suggesting alternative approaches that haven't been professionally validated. And worst of all, you've made Richard feel guilty about his perfectly appropriate parenting decisions by positioning yourself as the understanding mother figure that Nathan never had." Each accusation was calculated to exploit Richard's vulnerabilities: his guilt about Catherine's death, his insecurity about his parenting abilities, his fear that he was failing Nathan by not providing adequate professional help. Victoria was gambling that Richard's loyalty to his sister would ultimately outweigh his appreciation for Maria's contributions. "Mrs. Hayes," Maria said, standing up from the computer desk with deliberate dignity, "I think you should discuss your concerns with your brother directly. I don't want to come between family members who need to work things out together." "How convenient," Victoria replied sarcastically, "playing the martyr right until the end. But don't worry. I intend to have a very thorough conversation with Richard. By tomorrow morning, he'll understand exactly what kind of person he's invited into his home." That evening, Maria went through her usual routines with mechanical precision, her mind racing despite her calm exterior. She prepared Nathan's dinner, helped him organize his art supplies, and listened to his excited plans for expanding the spaceship story into multiple chapters. She gave no indication that her employment might be in jeopardy, not wanting to burden the boy with adult conflicts he could not control. But as she rode the bus back to the Mission District that night, Maria found herself mentally preparing for the possibility that her time with the Davenport family was about to end. Victoria's accusations were skillfully crafted, mixing legitimate concerns about professional boundaries with personal attacks designed to make Richard question Maria's motives. Even if Richard valued Maria's contributions to Nathan's well-being, he might decide that maintaining family harmony required choosing his sister over his housekeeper. The possibility of losing this job was particularly painful because Maria had begun to feel genuinely invested in Nathan's progress and Richard's growth as a father. She had seen firsthand how much both of them had benefited from learning new ways to communicate with each other. The thought that this progress might be interrupted or reversed because of workplace politics felt like a betrayal of everything she had worked to accomplish. But perhaps most troubling was Victoria's suggestion that Richard's gratitude was temporary and superficial, that Maria was fooling herself by believing that wealthy employers could form genuine connections with their domestic staff. The accusation forced Maria to examine her own motivations and expectations, to consider whether she had indeed overstepped appropriate boundaries by becoming emotionally invested in this family's healing process. As her bus carried her through the familiar streets of her neighborhood, Maria realized that tomorrow would bring a reckoning she could not avoid. Either Richard would recognize that her contributions to his family's well-being outweighed any concerns about professional protocol, or he would succumb to his sister's manipulations and terminate her employment. Either way, the comfortable routine they had developed over the past 3 months was about to be disrupted. That night, Maria knelt beside her small altar in the corner of her bedroom, lighting a candle for Nathan's continued happiness and Richard's wisdom in handling the family crisis that was about to unfold. She had done her best to help heal a broken family, using the skills and insights she had developed through her own experiences with loss, isolation, and the gradual reconstruction of hope. Whether that effort would be recognized or rejected was now beyond her control. But as she prepared for sleep, Maria felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that she had remained true to her fundamental values throughout the confrontation with Victoria. She had treated Nathan with the respect and understanding that every child deserves. She had supported Richard's efforts to become a better father without trying to replace Catherine's irreplaceable role in the family. And she had maintained her dignity even when under attack, refusing to respond to cruelty with cruelty. Whatever tomorrow brought, Maria would face it with the same steadiness that had carried her through every other challenge in her life. She had survived immigration, poverty, widowhood, and discrimination. She could survive the loss of one job, even if that job had come to mean more to her than she had initially intended. But she would not survive unchanged. The experience of working with Nathan and Richard had reminded her of her own strength as a healer and advocate, qualities that would serve her well regardless of where her next employment opportunity might take her. And if Victoria's campaign succeeded in ending her time with the Davenport family, Maria would carry with her the knowledge that she had made a real difference in at least one child's life, even if that difference was ultimately unrecognized or undervalued. Sometimes, she reminded herself, the most important victories were the ones that no one else witnessed or applauded. Nathan knew that someone had seen his true value and potential. Richard had learned new ways to connect with his son. Those accomplishments could not be erased by office politics or family dysfunction, no matter what happened next. The rain continued falling outside her window, washing the streets clean for whatever tomorrow might bring. The confrontation between Victoria and Richard took place the following evening in Richard's study. Behind closed doors that could not contain the sound of raised voices echoing through the mansion's halls. Maria was cleaning the second-floor bathrooms when the argument began, but even Nathan, sequestered in his third-floor bedroom, could hear the tension crackling through the house like electricity before a storm. Victoria had spent the day preparing her case with the thoroughness of an attorney building a prosecution. She had documented instances of what she characterized as Maria's inappropriate involvement in family matters, compiled a list of questions about her background and qualifications, and prepared emotional arguments about the need to protect Nathan from further instability. "Richard, you have to see what's happening here," Victoria began, her voice carrying the urgency of someone delivering a crucial warning. "This woman has systematically undermined every professional boundary that should exist in this household. She's conducting unauthorized research into Nathan's condition, giving you parenting advice, and encouraging Nathan to view his autism as some kind of special gift that doesn't require treatment." Richard looked up from the financial reports he'd been reviewing, his expression guarded. He had been expecting this conversation since Maria mentioned Victoria's concerns about computer access, and he had spent considerable time thinking about how to respond to his sister's criticisms. "Maria has been helpful with Nathan," he said carefully. "She seems to understand him in ways that other people don't." "That's exactly the problem," Victoria replied, settling into the leather chair across from his desk, like someone prepared for a lengthy siege. She's not qualified to understand him. Nathan needs professional intervention from people with advanced degrees and clinical experience, not emotional manipulation from a housekeeper who thinks she knows better than Dr. Morrison. I wouldn't call it manipulation, Richard said. She listens to Nathan. She asks questions about his artwork. She helps him feel heard and valued. She validates his symptoms instead of helping him overcome them, Victoria countered. Autism isn't a gift, Richard. It's a neurological condition that creates real challenges Nathan will need to manage for his entire life. By encouraging him to romanticize his differences instead of learning to adapt to social expectations, she's doing him a tremendous disservice. The argument touched on fundamental questions about disability, treatment, and the goals of therapeutic intervention, questions that Richard was not prepared to answer with confidence. Victoria's perspective reflected mainstream medical approaches that emphasized helping autistic individuals function as normally as possible in neurotypical environments. Maria's approach, by contrast, seemed to focus on helping Nathan develop confidence in his unique way of experiencing the world. Dr. Morrison hasn't objected to Nathan's artwork, Richard said, although his voice lacked conviction. Dr. Morrison doesn't know about the extent of Maria's involvement, Victoria replied. When was the last time you actually discussed Nathan's treatment plan with him? When was the last time you attended a therapy session? The questions stung because they highlighted Richard's tendency to delegate Nathan's care to professionals rather than actively participating in his treatment. Work demands and emotional avoidance had combined to make him a peripheral figure in his own son's therapeutic process, relying on reports and summaries rather than direct observation. I've been busy with the Yamamoto deal, Richard said defensively. The cryptocurrency market has been volatile, and we're trying to close the acquisition before... There will always be another deal, Victoria interrupted. There will always be another crisis at work that seems more urgent than Nathan's needs. That's exactly why we need professional boundaries with the household staff. You can't depend on the maid to provide the kind of consistent, qualified support that Nathan requires. The word maid was deliberately demeaning, designed to reduce Maria's contributions to her most basic job functions. Victoria understood that framing the discussion in terms of professional qualifications would appeal to Richard's business-minded approach to problem-solving. Maria isn't just a maid, Richard said, showing the first flash of irritation. She's intelligent, observant, and genuinely caring. Nathan responds to her in ways he doesn't respond to anyone else. Of course he responds to her, Victoria said with the patience of someone explaining an obvious point. She tells him everything he does is wonderful instead of helping him develop the skills he needs to function in the real world. Children with autism need structure and accountability, not endless validation of their antisocial behaviors. His artwork isn't antisocial, Richard protested. It's actually quite sophisticated. Some of his ideas about family dynamics are remarkably insightful. Victoria leaned forward in her chair, recognizing that this was the crucial moment in their conversation. Listen to yourself, Richard. You're talking about Nathan's pictures as if they're profound philosophy instead of the repetitive fixations of a child who needs help learning to engage with reality. That's exactly what I mean about Maria's inappropriate influence on your thinking. The accusation forced Richard to examine his own recent changes in perspective. Had Maria really helped him see Nathan more clearly, or had she manipulated him into romanticizing his son's condition? The self-doubt that Victoria was deliberately cultivating began to take root, fed by Richard's underlying guilt about his parenting failures. "What are you suggesting I do?" Richard asked, his voice quieter now. "I'm suggesting you remember who you are," Victoria replied, sensing victory within reach. "You're a successful businessman who built a fortune through careful analysis and sound decision-making. Would you hire an unqualified contractor to renovate this house? Would you trust an amateur to manage your investment portfolio? Then why are you trusting your son's emotional well-being to someone whose only qualification is that she's good at laundry?" The comparison was devastating. because it appealed directly to Richard's professional identity while dismissing the emotional intelligence that Maria had been trying to help him develop. Victoria was asking him to choose between two incompatible worldviews, one that valued measurable expertise and institutional credentials, another that valued intuition, empathy, and personal connection. Maria cares about Nathan, Richard said, but his protest sounded weaker than before. I'm sure she does, Victoria agreed with calculated magnanimity. But caring isn't enough. Nathan's future depends on him learning to navigate social situations, follow instructions, control his impulses, and maintain appropriate boundaries. Those are skills that require professional intervention, not amateur therapy from someone who shares his outsider perspective on the world. The phrase, outsider perspective, was particularly clever, suggesting that Maria's background made her unable to help Nathan integrate into mainstream society. Victoria was implying that social class differences between Maria and Nathan made her guidance counterproductive rather than helpful. Richard fell silent for several minutes, staring at his computer screen where cryptocurrency prices continued their endless fluctuations. The numbers provided a kind of comfort, objective, measurable, uninfluenced by emotion or personal bias. Perhaps Victoria was right that he had allowed sentiment to cloud his judgment about what Nathan really needed. What would you recommend? He asked finally. Victoria was prepared for this opening. First, we need to restore appropriate professional boundaries with the household staff. Maria should focus exclusively on her cleaning duties, with no involvement in Nathan's personal care or educational activities. Second, we need to increase Nathan's structured therapy sessions with qualified professionals who can help him develop real-world skills. Third, you need to take a more active role in his treatment plan instead of depending on other people to interpret his needs for you. The recommendations sounded reasonable, even necessary when presented as a coherent professional development plan. Richard found himself nodding along, already mentally composing the conversation he would need to have with Maria about revised job responsibilities. But their discussion was interrupted by an unexpected sound from upstairs. Nathan's voice, raised in distress, calling for Maria. The sound was urgent enough that both adults immediately stopped talking and listened for additional information. Maria! Maria! Nathan's voice carried a note of panic that made Richard's parental instincts override his analytical caution. He was out of his chair and heading for the stairs before Victoria could remind him about appropriate boundaries. They found Nathan in his bedroom, surrounded by scattered drawings and crying with the particular intensity that indicated sensory overload. When he saw his father and aunt in the doorway, he became more agitated rather than less, clearly wanting someone who was not available. Where's Maria? Nathan asked through his tears. I need Maria. She's gone for the day, Richard said, approaching slowly. But I'm here. Can you tell me what's wrong? You don't understand, Nathan replied, his words coming in gasps between sobs. You don't know how to read the pictures. Only Maria knows how to read them. Richard looked around the room, trying to understand what had triggered this episode. Nathan's latest drawing lay open on his desk, a complex image that seemed to show the mansion during some kind of disaster, with figures running in different directions while dark clouds gathered overhead. It looked like a child's representation of family conflict, possibly inspired by the raised voices he had been hearing from downstairs. Can you explain the picture to me? Richard asked, genuinely trying to apply the listening techniques Maria had been teaching him. But Nathan was beyond the reach of rational conversation. His nervous system was in full crisis mode, overwhelmed by sounds, emotions, and the disruption of his evening routine. When Richard reached out to comfort him, Nathan pulled away, his body rigid with the kind of defensive posture that indicated touch would feel painful rather than soothing. Victoria watched this interaction with mixed emotions. Part of her felt vindicated. Here was clear evidence that Richard lacked the skills necessary to help Nathan through his difficult moments. But another part of her felt genuinely concerned about her nephew's distress, wondering if her victory over Maria was worth the immediate cost to Nathan's well-being. I'll call Dr. Morrison, Victoria said. Maybe he can provide some guidance over the phone. No, Nathan said sharply. Doctor. Morrison doesn't understand either. None of you understand. Only Maria understands, and you made her go away. The accusation hung in the air like an indictment. Nathan, despite his youth and his autism, had perceived the conflict between Victoria and Maria with remarkable clarity. He understood that adult politics were threatening his most important emotional support system. Richard felt a pang of guilt so sharp it was almost physical. In his desire to maintain family harmony and follow his sister's professional advice, he was about to eliminate the one person who had successfully connected with his son in months. The irony was devastating. He was planning to choose expertise over relationship at exactly the moment when Nathan most needed relationship over expertise. Nathan, Richard said softly, Maria hasn't gone away forever. She'll be back tomorrow. But you're going to fire her, Nathan replied with devastating accuracy. Aunt Victoria wants you to fire her because she thinks Maria isn't smart enough to help me. But Maria is the smartest person about feelings. She knows what my pictures mean even when I can't find the words to explain them. Victoria stepped forward, her voice gentler than it had been during the argument with Richard. Nathan, sweetheart, we're not trying to take anyone away from you. We just want to make sure you get the best possible help for your special needs. My needs aren't special, Nathan said, his tears slowing as anger replaced panic. They're just my needs, and Maria was helping me with them better than anyone else ever has, but you don't want her to help because she cleans toilets. And you think people who clean toilets can't be smart about other things. The blunt assessment of Victoria's class prejudices was so accurate that she found herself speechless for the first time in the conversation. Nathan's emotional intelligence had cut straight through the professional rhetoric she had been using to justify her position, exposing the fundamental bias that made her uncomfortable with Maria's influence in their lives. Richard looked at his son with new respect, recognizing that Nathan's understanding of the situation was far more sophisticated than anyone had realized. The boy was not just reacting to the loss of emotional support. He was making a moral argument about dignity, respect, and the value of different kinds of intelligence. You're right, Richard said slowly, the admission surprising everyone in the room, including himself. Maria is smart about feelings, and feelings are important, even if they're harder to measure than other things. Victoria started to object, but Richard held up his hand to stop her. Nathan, I promise you that I won't make any decisions about Maria without talking to you first. Your opinion matters to me, and I should have asked for it before now. The promise seemed to calm Nathan somewhat, although he remained wary of adult commitments that might be broken under pressure. Do you mean it? Or are you just saying that to make me stop crying? I mean it, Richard said, and for the first time in their conversation, his voice carried complete conviction. Maria has helped both of us learn to talk to each other better. That's worth more than I realized. As they talked Nathan through the rest of his bedtime routine, Richard found himself thinking about the cryptocurrency markets that had seemed so urgent an hour earlier. Numbers rising and falling on computer screens, profits and losses measured in millions of dollars, none of it meant anything compared to his son's emotional well-being and their slowly rebuilding relationship. Victoria watched this reconciliation with resignation, understanding that her campaign against Maria had backfired spectacularly. In trying to force Richard to choose between professional credibility and personal connection, she had inadvertently helped him recognize that the most important aspects of parenting could not be outsourced to experts or solved through institutional interventions. But perhaps most significantly, Nathan had demonstrated that his autism did not prevent him from understanding complex social dynamics or advocating for his own needs with remarkable clarity. The boy whom Victoria had described as needing protection from reality had just delivered one of the most insightful analyses of family dysfunction that any of them had ever heard. That night, after Victoria had retreated to her wing of the mansion and Nathan had finally fallen asleep, Richard sat alone in his study thinking about the evening's revelations. He realized that his sister's concerns about professional boundaries were not entirely wrong. Maria had indeed taken on responsibilities that went far beyond typical housekeeping duties. But Victoria's proposed solution of eliminating Maria's influence entirely was based on assumptions about class, education, and expertise that Nathan had exposed as fundamentally flawed. The real question was not whether Maria was qualified to help Nathan, but whether Richard was prepared to acknowledge that qualification could come from sources other than advanced degrees and clinical credentials. Maria's effectiveness with Nathan was based on lived experience with difference, marginalization, and the particular kind of strength that developed through navigating systems that were not designed for people like them. Richard picked up his phone to call Maria, then put it down again, unsure how to begin a conversation that would require him to admit how close he had come to undermining everything they had accomplished together. He would need to find words for concepts he was just beginning to understand, that healing often happened through relationship rather than treatment, that wisdom could be found in unexpected places, and that his son's needs might be better served by someone who understood exclusion from personal experience than by experts who studied it from professional distance. Most importantly, he would need to apologize not just to Maria, but to Nathan for allowing family politics to overshadow his commitment to supporting his son's emotional growth. The boy deserved a father who would prioritize his well-being over adult convenience, who would fight for relationships that helped him flourish rather than sacrificing them to maintain superficial harmony. Outside his study window, the San Francisco fog was beginning to lift, revealing glimpses of the city lights that stretched toward the bay. Richard found himself thinking about Maria's daily commute from the Mission District, the journey she made between her own world and his, carrying with her insights and capabilities that his wealth had been unable to purchase. Tomorrow, he would ask her to stay, not just as an employee, but as a partner in the ongoing work of helping Nathan become the person he was meant to be. It would require renegotiating boundaries, redefining roles, and finding ways to honor both professional competence and emotional intelligence. But for the first time since Catherine's death, Richard felt genuinely hopeful about his family's future. Nathan had shown him that healing was possible, that connection could be rebuilt, and that the most important victories often came through unexpected alliances with people who had been overlooked or underestimated. The fog continued lifting, revealing a clear view of the world beyond the mansion's walls. Maria arrived for work the next morning carrying the weight of uncertainty like a heavy backpack. She had spent a sleepless night imagining various scenarios: termination, demotion, or perhaps a painful conversation about new restrictions on her interactions with Nathan. The bus ride from the Mission District had felt longer than usual, each stoplight providing more time to worry about what awaited her at the mansion. But when she entered through the service door, she was surprised to find Richard waiting for her in the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that mixed apology with determination. Nathan sat at the breakfast table nearby, working quietly on a new drawing that seemed to depict a bridge spanning between 2 different landscapes. "Maria," Richard began, his voice carrying a formality that made her brace for bad news. "I need to apologize to you about yesterday. My sister raised some concerns about the scope of your responsibilities here, and I initially thought she might be right. But Nathan helped me understand that I was about to make a serious mistake." Maria glanced at Nathan, who looked up from his drawing with eyes that seemed older and wiser than his 10 years. She could see that some kind of important conversation had taken place between father and son, one that had shifted the dynamic she had feared was moving against her. "Nathan explained to me that you're the first person who has really understood his artwork and what he's trying to communicate through it," Richard continued. "He also pointed out that my sister's objections to your involvement might have more to do with prejudices about education and social class than with genuine concerns about Nathan's well-being." The admission was clearly difficult for Richard to make, requiring him to acknowledge not just his own misjudgment, but his family's bias against people from Maria's background. Maria listened quietly, allowing him to find his way through the apology without making it easier for him by offering premature forgiveness. "I've been thinking all night about what's really best for Nathan," Richard said. "And I keep coming back to the fact that he's made more progress in the past few months than in the previous 2 years. His drawings are more complex, his communication skills have improved, and he seems happier, more confident. Those changes coincided directly with your arrival here." Nathan looked up again, this time making eye contact with Maria in a way that conveyed both gratitude and hope. "I told Dad that you're the first adult who listens to my pictures instead of just looking at them," he said. "Most people see the colors and shapes, but you see the feelings underneath." Maria felt tears gathering behind her eyes, moved not just by Nathan's words, but by the evidence that Richard had actually heard and valued his son's perspective. It was exactly the kind of breakthrough she had been hoping for, a moment when Richard chose Nathan's emotional needs over adult convenience and social expectations. "I want to ask you something," Richard continued, his voice becoming less formal and more personal. "Would you be willing to expand your role here beyond housekeeping? I'd like you to work more directly with Nathan on his art and communication, maybe coordinate with Dr. Morrison to integrate your approaches with his therapy goals. It would mean a significant increase in both responsibilities and compensation." The offer was more than Maria had dared to hope for, but she was careful not to show too much enthusiasm too quickly. She had learned from experience that wealthy families sometimes made generous promises in moments of emotional intensity that they later regretted in calmer circumstances. "What would that look like practically?" she asked. "And what about Mrs. Hayes's concerns about my qualifications?" Richard's expression tightened slightly at the mention of his sister. "Victoria's concerns are noted, but Nathan's well-being takes priority over anyone else's comfort level with our household arrangements. As for qualifications, I've realized that there are different kinds of expertise. You have experience with communication challenges, with helping people who feel misunderstood, with seeing potential in situations where others see only problems. Those qualifications can't be earned in graduate school." Nathan had been listening to this conversation while continuing to work on his drawing, but now he held up his latest creation for both adults to see. The picture showed the bridge he had been working on, but now there were figures crossing from both sides, some moving from a colorful, chaotic landscape toward a more structured, geometric one, others traveling in the opposite direction. "It's about translation," Nathan explained. "Sometimes people need help getting from one place to another, even when the places aren't really that far apart. The bridge doesn't change either place, but it makes it safe for people to visit each other." Maria studied the drawing carefully, recognizing Nathan's sophisticated metaphor for the role she had been playing in his family. She was not trying to eliminate the differences between Nathan's world and his father's world, but rather to create connections that allowed them to understand and appreciate those differences. "That's beautiful, mijo," she said softly. "You're right that bridges don't change the places they connect. They just make it easier for people to find each other." Richard looked between Nathan's drawing and Maria's interpretation, beginning to understand how their collaborative approach to communication might serve as a model for other aspects of family life. Nathan provided the creative insights, while Maria helped translate them into language that Richard could understand and apply. "So what do you think?" Richard asked. "Would you be interested in expanding your role here?" Maria took a sip of her coffee, using the time to consider not just the professional opportunity, but the personal implications of deeper involvement with this family. She understood that accepting would mean taking on emotional risks that went beyond typical employment relationships. But she also understood that refusing would mean abandoning Nathan at a crucial point in his development and walking away from the most meaningful work she had done in years. "I'd be honored," she said finally, "but I want to be clear about something. If we're going to work together as a team, it means everyone needs to commit to putting Nathan's needs first, even when that's uncomfortable or inconvenient. It means being patient with the process and trusting approaches that might not look like traditional therapy. Agreed, Richard said immediately, and I want to make another commitment. I want to be more involved in Nathan's daily life, not just his treatment planning. Can you help me learn to understand his artwork the way you do? The request represented a fundamental shift in Richard's approach to parenting, from managing Nathan's condition to engaging with Nathan's experience. Maria could see that this change had the potential to transform not just the father-son relationship, but Richard's understanding of himself as a parent. Of course, Maria replied, but you should know that Nathan is an excellent teacher when adults are ready to be students. Most of what I've learned about his art has come directly from him. Nathan beamed at this acknowledgement of his expertise, clearly pleased to be recognized as a source of knowledge rather than just a recipient of adult intervention. I can teach Dad about color symbolism and geometric patterns and how feelings look different when you draw them instead of talking about them, he said eagerly. That sounds perfect, Richard said, his voice carrying genuine enthusiasm for the first time in their conversation. When do we start? What followed was the most productive morning the three of them had ever spent together. Nathan took on the role of instructor, explaining his artistic techniques and the symbolic systems he had developed for representing complex emotions. Richard asked thoughtful questions that demonstrated his growing respect for his son's intelligence and creativity. Maria served as facilitator and translator, helping bridge the communication gaps that still occasionally arose. They worked in Nathan's room, surrounded by hundreds of drawings that collectively told the story of a brilliant, sensitive child trying to make sense of loss, family dysfunction, and his own neurodivergent experience of the world. As Richard studied these images with new attention, he began to see patterns and themes that revealed Nathan's sophisticated understanding of the emotional dynamics around him. One series of drawings showed the mansion during different seasons, with the architecture remaining constant, but the emotional atmosphere changing dramatically based on the interactions between family members. Summer pictures were bright and connected, with figures engaged in shared activities and flowers blooming in every room. Winter pictures were stark and isolated, with each figure trapped in separate spaces despite living in the same house. These are from last year, Nathan explained, pointing to a particularly bleak winter drawing. After Mom died, but before Maria came. Everyone was sad, but we were all sad in different rooms. Richard stared at the image, recognizing the accuracy of Nathan's visual assessment. The family had indeed been grieving in isolation, each person managing their pain privately rather than supporting each other through shared vulnerability. What about this one? Richard asked, indicating a more recent drawing that showed the mansion with transparent walls and figures moving freely between rooms. That's now, Nathan said simply. After Maria taught us that walls don't have to keep people apart if you know how to make doors. The metaphor was so apt that Richard found himself smiling, despite the serious nature of their conversation. Nathan had captured something essential about Maria's contribution to their family, not that she had solved their problems, but that she had shown them ways to connect across the barriers they had constructed around their individual pain. Their collaborative session was interrupted by Mrs. Henderson, who appeared in the doorway with news that Dr. Morrison had arrived for Nathan's regularly scheduled therapy appointment. The timing felt awkward given the morning's revelations about expanded roles and new approaches to Nathan's care. Should I explain the new arrangement to Dr. Morrison? Richard asked Maria quietly. Why don't we let Nathan explain it? Maria suggested. He's the one who understands best how all the pieces fit together. The suggestion that Nathan should take the lead in discussing his own treatment plan was revolutionary within the context of traditional medical approaches where children were typically discussed rather than consulted. But it made perfect sense, given Nathan's demonstrated ability to articulate his needs and evaluate the effectiveness of different interventions. Dr. Morrison, a well-meaning but somewhat rigid therapist who had been working with Nathan for over a year, was initially skeptical of the new collaborative approach. He had been trained in evidence-based practices that relied on structured protocols and measurable outcomes, and Nathan's artistic explorations did not fit neatly into those frameworks. But when Nathan began explaining his latest drawings to Dr. Morrison, with the same enthusiasm he had shown Richard and Maria, the therapist found himself genuinely intrigued by the complexity of the boy's symbolic thinking. Nathan's artwork revealed cognitive and emotional processes that had been largely invisible during traditional therapy sessions. "These are quite sophisticated," Dr. Morrison admitted, studying a drawing that showed different therapeutic approaches as various tools in a workshop. Some tools were mechanical and precise, others were organic and intuitive, but all were depicted as necessary for different kinds of construction projects. "Nathan's been developing his own therapeutic vocabulary through visual art," Maria explained. "We think it might complement the work you're doing with him in sessions." "It's like having two different languages for the same feelings," Nathan added. "Sometimes talking works better, and sometimes drawing works better. But both ways help me understand what's happening inside my head." Dr. Morrison spent the next hour reviewing Nathan's artwork with genuine curiosity, asking questions about techniques and meanings while taking notes about potential integration strategies. By the end of the session, he had agreed to modify Nathan's treatment plan to include regular discussions of his artistic work. "I have to admit," Dr. Morrison told Richard privately as he prepared to leave, "Nathan's communication skills have improved dramatically since our last assessment. Whatever changes you've made in his home environment seem to be having significant positive effects." The professional validation of their collaborative approach felt like a victory, but Maria understood that the real test would come in sustaining this new dynamic over time. Family systems were resistant to change, and the habits that had developed over years of dysfunction would not disappear overnight. Victoria's response to the new arrangement was a case in point. When she learned that Maria's role had been expanded rather than eliminated, her initial reaction was cold fury, followed by strategic withdrawal. She began spending more time away from the mansion, visiting friends in Marin County, and attending cultural events that kept her occupied during the hours when Nathan, Richard, and Maria worked together. But Victoria's absence, while reducing immediate conflict, also created new concerns about family unity and long-term stability. Richard was torn between his commitment to Nathan's progress and his desire to maintain relationships with other family members who felt displaced by the changes. "I don't want to lose my sister over this," Richard confided to Maria during one of their evening debriefings. "But I also can't go back to the way things were before. Nathan is happier and more confident than he's been since his mother died." "Change is hard for everyone," Maria replied. "Mrs. Hayes might need time to see that Nathan's progress doesn't threaten her place in the family. Maybe there's a way to include her in what we're doing instead of making her feel excluded by it." The suggestion led to a delicate conversation in which Richard invited Victoria to observe one of their collaborative sessions with Nathan. Initially resistant, Victoria eventually agreed to watch from a distance as Nathan explained his latest artistic project, a complex mural depicting his family's journey through grief toward healing. What Victoria witnessed was transformative. Instead of the chaos and unprofessional boundary crossing she had expected, she saw a carefully structured collaboration in which each participant had a clearly defined role. Nathan was the creative leader, generating ideas and explaining meanings. Richard was the engaged student, asking questions and providing practical support. Maria was the skilled facilitator, helping translate between different communication styles and maintaining focus on therapeutic goals. Most importantly, Victoria saw her nephew displaying confidence, articulation, and emotional intelligence that she had never fully recognized before. Nathan was not the damaged child who needed protection from overstimulation that she had been imagining, but rather a complex young person whose differences were sources of insight rather than deficits requiring correction. "I owe you an apology," Victoria told Maria privately after the session ended. "I let my own fears and prejudices interfere with seeing what was actually happening here. Nathan is flourishing under your guidance, and Richard is becoming the father he should have been all along." The apology was gracious, But Maria understood that rebuilding trust would require time and consistent positive experiences. Victoria's initial concerns had not been entirely unreasonable. Boundaries were important in professional relationships, and Nathan's needs were complex enough to require careful attention from qualified adults. But the crisis had also revealed something important about the nature of healing and the sources of wisdom. Nathan's progress had not come through traditional therapeutic interventions alone, but through relationship with someone who understood difference from personal experience and approached it with curiosity rather than pathology. As spring arrived in San Francisco, bringing longer days and the return of color to the mansion's carefully maintained gardens, the Davenport family found themselves settling into new routines that balanced structure with flexibility, professional expertise with emotional intelligence, individual needs with collective harmony. Nathan continued working with Dr. Morrison on social skills and coping strategies, but these sessions were now enriched by discussions of his artistic work and the insights he had developed about his own neurological differences. Richard maintained his business responsibilities, but made Nathan a non-negotiable priority, scheduling meetings around therapy sessions and family time rather than treating them as secondary concerns. Most significantly, Maria had found a way to contribute her gifts and experience to meaningful work that honored both her competence and her humanity. She was not just an employee anymore, but a valued member of a healing community that recognized wisdom wherever it appeared and trusted relationship as much as credentials. The transformation was not complete. Families were works in progress rather than finished products, but the direction was clear. Love was learning to express itself across differences of neurology, class, education, and experience. Understanding was replacing judgment. Connection was transcending the barriers that grief and fear had constructed. And in Nathan's latest drawings, all the doors remained open. 6 months into Maria's expanded role with the Davenport family, their carefully constructed harmony was shattered by an accusation that threatened to destroy everything they had built together. The crisis began on a Tuesday morning in late spring, when Mrs. Henderson discovered that an antique silver picture frame had gone missing from Richard's study, a valuable piece that had belonged to Catherine's grandmother and held particular sentimental significance. The frame had been displayed prominently on Richard's desk, containing a photograph of Catherine and Nathan taken during their last family vacation to Lake Tahoe. Its absence was immediately noticeable, and Mrs. Henderson's discovery launched a methodical search of the study that revealed no obvious signs of forced entry or disturbance to other valuable items. "I noticed it was missing when I was dusting this morning," Mrs. Henderson reported to Richard with the careful neutrality of someone who had worked in wealthy households long enough to understand the implications of theft accusations. "I've searched thoroughly, but the frame doesn't seem to have been misplaced accidentally." Richard felt a cold knot forming in his stomach as the implications became clear. The mansion's security system had not been triggered, which meant that whoever had taken the frame either had legitimate access to the house or knew how to circumvent the alarm system. The pool of suspects was limited to household staff and family members, a reality that made the accusation both more serious and more personal. Victoria was the first to voice what everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to say directly. "I hate to suggest this," she said with carefully modulated concern, "but we need to consider that someone with regular access to the house might have taken advantage of their position." The euphemistic language could not disguise the specific direction of her suspicion. Maria was the only staff member whose role had expanded significantly in recent months, giving her increased access to areas of the house that had previously been off-limits. She was also the staff member whose background had not been as thoroughly vetted, having been hired during a period of crisis rather than through the family's usual careful screening process. "Let's not jump to conclusions," Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. The timing of the theft, coinciding with Maria's increased involvement in family activities, was difficult to ignore from a purely logical standpoint. Nathan, who had been listening to this conversation from the hallway, entered the study with an expression of distress that immediately shifted everyone's attention. "You think Maria took the picture frame," he said with the blunt directness that characterized his communication style. "We don't think anything yet," Richard replied quickly. "We're just trying to understand what happened." "But you suspect her because she's the one who's different from the rest of us," Nathan continued, his voice rising with indignation that was rare for him. "Because she lives in a different neighborhood and doesn't have the same kind of money we have." The accuracy of Nathan's assessment was uncomfortable for the adults in the room. While none of them had explicitly articulated class-based suspicions, the assumption that Maria was the most likely culprit did seem to rest on stereotypes about poverty and criminality rather than objective evidence. "Nathan, that's not fair," Victoria said gently. "We have to consider all possibilities when something valuable goes missing. It's not about Maria personally." "It is about her personally," Nathan replied with mounting agitation. "Maria would never take anything that didn't belong to her. She's the most honest person I know. She even brings back the extra change when Mrs. Chen gives her too much money for lunch." The defense was touching, but not necessarily decisive from an investigative standpoint. Richard found himself caught between his son's emotional loyalty to Maria and the practical necessity of treating the theft seriously. The picture frame had both monetary and sentimental value, and its disappearance could not be dismissed without thorough investigation. The situation became more complicated when Mrs. Henderson reported that she had seen Maria in Richard's study the previous evening, long after her usual working hours. She said she was looking for some papers that Mr. Nathan had asked her to find, Mrs. Henderson explained. "Educational materials or therapy resources, I believe, but she was alone in there for quite some time." This information transformed the situation from vague suspicion to specific accusation. Maria had been in the study at an unusual time, without direct supervision, with access to the frame that subsequently went missing. From an employer's perspective, the coincidence was too significant to ignore. When Richard confronted Maria about the missing frame during her arrival for work the next morning, her reaction only deepened his concerns. Instead of expressing surprise or indignation at being suspected, Maria went very quiet and still, her face closing down in a way that suggested she was protecting herself from expected pain. "I didn't take anything," she said simply, her voice flat and careful. "I was in the study looking for information about art therapy programs, like I told Mrs. Henderson, but I didn't touch anything else." The response was technically adequate but emotionally unsatisfying. Richard had expected Maria to be upset by the accusation, to express hurt or anger at being suspected of theft. Her calm acceptance seemed to suggest either guilt or a troubling familiarity with being wrongly accused. "Maria," Richard said, trying to balance fairness with firmness, "I want to believe you, but I need to understand what happened. The frame was definitely in the study 2 days ago, and now it's gone. If you didn't take it, do you have any idea who might have?" Maria looked directly at him for the first time in their conversation, and Richard saw something in her eyes that made him profoundly uncomfortable. Not guilt, but a kind of resigned disappointment, as if she had been expecting this moment since the day she was hired. "Mr. Davenport," she said quietly, "in my experience, when rich people lose something valuable, they usually blame the poorest person who had access to it. It doesn't matter how long that person has worked faithfully or how much they've contributed to the family's well-being. When something goes wrong, we're always the most convenient suspects." The statement was delivered without bitterness, which somehow made it more devastating than anger would have been. Maria was not defending herself so much as explaining a pattern she had observed throughout her working life. The automatic assumption that domestic workers were morally as well as economically inferior to their employers. "This isn't about your background," Richard protested, although even as he said the words, he wondered if they were entirely true. "Isn't it?" Maria asked with gentle skepticism. "If Mrs. Henderson or Dr. Morrison had been in your study that evening, would you be having the same conversation with them today?" The question forced Richard to examine his own assumptions about trustworthiness and social class. Would he really have suspected a professional therapist or longtime employee with the same readiness that he suspected Maria? The honest answer was probably not, which meant that Nathan's earlier accusation about prejudice had been more accurate than uncomfortable. But regardless of the motivations behind the suspicion, the practical problem remained. Something valuable was missing, and Maria had been the last known person in the area where it had disappeared. Richard felt trapped between his growing respect for Maria as a person and his responsibility as an employer to investigate potential theft seriously. The tension was temporarily relieved by Nathan's appearance in the kitchen, carrying something wrapped carefully in one of his art cloths. "I know where the picture frame is," he announced with the matter-of-fact tone he used for stating obvious truths. Richard and Maria both turned to stare at him. "You know where it is?" Richard asked. Nathan nodded and began unwrapping the bundle he carried. Inside was Catherine's antique silver frame, apparently undamaged and containing the same Lake Tahoe photograph that had been missing from Richard's desk. "I took it," Nathan said simply. "I wanted to draw Mom, but I needed to see her face really clearly to get the details right. So I borrowed the picture for a few days." The revelation was simultaneously a relief and a source of new complications. Maria was obviously innocent of theft, which addressed the immediate crisis. But Nathan's explanation raised questions about boundaries, communication, and the family's ongoing efforts to establish appropriate rules for household behavior. "Nathan," Richard said carefully, "you can't just take things from other people's rooms without asking permission, even if you have good reasons and plan to return them." "I know," Nathan replied with genuine remorse. "I was going to ask, but you were on important phone calls all week, and I didn't want to interrupt. I thought I could put it back before anyone noticed it was gone." The explanation was typical of Nathan's literal-minded approach to social situations. He had correctly identified the problem, he needed better visual reference for his artwork, and developed a logical solution that addressed his immediate need. But he had not fully considered the broader implications of his actions or the worry his borrowing would cause. "Next time, please ask me directly, even if I'm busy," Richard said. "Interrupting a phone call is better than making people worry about missing family treasures." "I will," Nathan promised. "But Dad, you should apologize to Maria. You accused her of stealing when she was just trying to help me find educational resources like you asked her to do." The correction was gentle but firm, demonstrating Nathan's sophisticated understanding of fairness and his loyalty to someone who had consistently supported him. Richard felt a flush of shame as he realized how quickly he had moved from trust to suspicion without substantial evidence. "You're absolutely right," Richard said, turning to face Maria directly. "I owe you a sincere apology. I let fear override judgment, and I made assumptions that were unfair and probably based on prejudices I didn't want to acknowledge." Maria accepted the apology with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout the accusation, but Richard could see that damage had been done to their relationship. Trust, once broken, required time and consistent behavior to rebuild, and he understood that his quick movement to suspicion had revealed something about his character that Maria would not forget easily. The incident might have remained a minor family drama, except for Victoria's reaction to the resolution. Instead of being relieved that no theft had actually occurred, she seemed almost disappointed that her initial suspicions had proven unfounded. "This whole situation illustrates exactly what I was concerned about regarding boundaries and supervision," Victoria announced during a family meeting that evening. Nathan taking valuable items without permission, Maria being alone in restricted areas of the house, communication breakdowns that led to false accusations. These are all symptoms of an excessively informal household management approach. The criticism stung because it contained elements of truth mixed with unfair characterizations. Nathan's impulsive borrowing of the picture frame did suggest a need for clearer guidelines about family property. Maria's evening search of Richard's study, while innocent in intent, had created the appearance of inappropriate access. The whole crisis could have been avoided with better communication protocols. But Victoria's interpretation of these events is evidence that the collaborative approach to Nathan's care was fundamentally flawed, struck both Richard and Nathan as unfair. The missing frame had been a minor communication problem, not the major household crisis that Victoria was describing. "Aunt Victoria," Nathan said with the patience of someone explaining an obvious point to a confused adult, "the frame problem happened because I didn't ask permission, not because Maria was doing anything wrong. She was trying to help me find therapy resources that Dad said she should help me find." "That's exactly my point," Victoria replied. "The lines of authority and responsibility have become so blurred that a 10-year-old boy feels comfortable taking valuable family heirlooms without asking, and domestic staff feel entitled to search private areas of the house without direct supervision." The phrase "domestic staff" was clearly intended to remind everyone of Maria's official role and social position, reducing her contributions to the family's well-being back to her original job description. Victoria was attempting to use the frame incident as justification for returning to more traditional employer-employee boundaries, but Nathan was not persuaded by his aunt's arguments. "Maria isn't just domestic staff," he said with the blunt honesty that characterized his communication style. "She's part of our family now. She helps Dad understand me, and she helps me understand Dad. If we go back to treating her like someone who just cleans toilets, we'll lose all the progress we've made." The defense was touching, but also somewhat naive about the complexities of household management and professional relationships. Richard found himself once again caught between competing visions of how their family should operate. Victoria's emphasis on clear boundaries and proper authority versus Nathan's vision of inclusive collaboration and emotional connection. Maria herself remained largely quiet during these discussions, sensing that her own advocacy for either position would be inappropriate given her employee status and the recent suspicion about her trustworthiness. But her silence was itself a kind of communication, suggesting that she understood the precarious nature of her expanded role and was prepared for either acceptance or rejection. The resolution came from an unexpected source, Dr. Morrison, who had been observing the family dynamics during his regular sessions with Nathan and had begun to understand how the household's emotional climate affected Nathan's therapeutic progress. "I'd like to share some observations," Dr. Morrison told Richard during a private consultation. "Nathan's development over the past 6 months has been remarkable by any measure. His communication skills, emotional regulation, and social confidence have all improved significantly. These gains coincide directly with the collaborative approach you've developed with Maria." The professional validation carried weight that emotional arguments could not match. Dr. Morrison continued, "I've worked with hundreds of families dealing with autism spectrum challenges, and I can tell you that Nathan's progress is exceptional. Whatever you're doing at home is working better than most traditional interventions I've seen." "But what about appropriate boundaries and professional oversight?" Richard asked, echoing Victoria's concerns. "Boundaries are important," Dr. Morrison agreed, "but they need to serve therapeutic goals rather than arbitrary social conventions. Nathan responds well to Maria because she treats his differences as interesting rather than problematic. That's actually a sophisticated therapeutic stance that many professionals struggle to maintain." The conversation helped Richard understand that the choice he faced was not between professional competence and emotional warmth, but between different models of what professional competence might look like. Maria's approach to Nathan's needs was not unprofessional. It was based on different professional values that prioritized relationship and understanding over standardization and control. Armed with this perspective, Richard was able to have a more productive conversation with Victoria about household management and family priorities. Instead of defending Maria's expanded role as a personal favor or emotional indulgence, he could present it as a strategic decision based on demonstrated therapeutic outcomes. "I understand your concerns about boundaries and communication," Richard told his sister. but I need to prioritize Nathan's well-being over conventional social expectations. Maria's contributions to his development have been invaluable, and Dr. Morrison confirms that our collaborative approach is producing exceptional results. Victoria listened to this explanation with the careful attention of someone evaluating a business proposal rather than fighting a personal battle. When presented as a rational decision based on professional recommendations rather than emotional attachment, Maria's expanded role became more defensible from her perspective. I suppose my concerns were more about the appearance of impropriety than actual impropriety, Victoria admitted. If Dr. Morrison endorses the current arrangement and Nathan continues to make progress, then I can support maintaining it. The compromise allowed all parties to save face while preserving the collaborative approach that had proven so beneficial for Nathan's development. But it also established new protocols for communication and household management that addressed Victoria's legitimate concerns about accountability and transparency. Maria would continue her expanded role, but with clearer documentation of her activities and more regular check-ins with Dr. Morrison about therapeutic goals and methods. Nathan would have clearer guidelines about family property and permission seeking, but within a context that respected his intelligence and growing maturity. Richard would take a more active role in day-to-day household management, but without micromanaging the collaborative relationship that had proven so effective. Most importantly, the crisis had forced all parties to articulate their values and priorities more clearly, creating a foundation for future decision-making that was based on Nathan's needs rather than adult convenience or social expectations. The missing picture frame, once returned to its place on Richard's desk, became a symbol of lessons learned rather than trust broken. Nathan's artistic project, the portrait of his mother that had motivated the borrowing, was completed and displayed prominently in the family's main hallway, a reminder that love often motivated actions that looked like problems from the outside. And Maria, having survived both false accusation and family drama, found her position more secure than ever, not because she had proven her innocence, but because she had demonstrated grace under pressure and continued commitment to Nathan's well-being, even when her own status was threatened. The frame incident became a turning point that strengthened rather than weakened the family's collaborative approach to healing, proving that trust, once rebuilt on solid foundations, could become even stronger than it had been originally. Summer in San Francisco brought an unexpected opportunity for the Davenport family to test their newfound harmony against the pressures of extended social interaction. Richard's business partner, James Yamamoto, invited them to spend a long weekend at his family's estate in Napa Valley, celebrating the successful completion of their cryptocurrency acquisition deal. The invitation included not just Richard and Nathan, but also extended to any household staff who might be helpful with Nathan's special needs. The phrasing was delicate but clear. James understood that Nathan required additional support, and he was offering to include whoever provided that support as part of the family entourage. For Richard, this represented both an opportunity to showcase Nathan's progress and a test of whether their collaborative approach would survive exposure to the judgment of his business associates. "I'd like you to come with us," Richard told Maria as they discussed the weekend plans. "Nathan does best in new environments when he has familiar people around, and you've become essential to his sense of security." The invitation was generous, but Maria understood the complexities involved in accompanying a wealthy family to a social event among their peers. She would be in an ambiguous position, more than a typical employee, but not quite a family member, interacting with people who might not understand or appreciate her expanded role in Nathan's care. "What would you like me to do while we're there?" Maria asked carefully. "I want to be helpful, but I also don't want to create awkwardness for you or the Yamamoto family." Richard paused, realizing that he hadn't fully thought through the social dynamics of bringing Maria to what was essentially a business celebration. In their private family context, her role as Nathan's advocate and interpreter had evolved naturally. But in a more public setting, the boundaries between professional support and personal relationship might become more complicated to navigate. "I think we'll figure it out as we go," Richard said, which was both honest and less reassuring than Maria might have hoped. The most important thing is that Nathan feels comfortable and supported. Everything else is secondary. Nathan, when consulted about the weekend plans, was enthusiastic about the trip but adamant about wanting Maria to accompany them. "I've never been to James's house before," he explained, "and new places have too many variables for me to process alone. Maria helps me organize the sensory information so I don't get overwhelmed." The clinical accuracy of Nathan's self-assessment was remarkable for a 10-year-old, demonstrating how much his self-awareness had grown through his collaborative work with Maria and Dr. Morrison. But it also highlighted the practical reality that Nathan's autism made certain accommodations genuinely necessary rather than merely convenient. Victoria chose not to join the Napa Valley weekend, citing prior social commitments in the city. Her absence removed one potential source of tension, but it also meant that Maria would be the only family support person accompanying Richard and Nathan into unfamiliar social territory. The Yamamoto estate was impressive even by San Francisco wealth standards, a sprawling compound of connected buildings surrounded by manicured vineyards and gardens that seemed to stretch to the horizon. James Yamamoto had made his fortune in early cryptocurrency investments before diversifying into real estate and technology ventures, and his lifestyle reflected both sophisticated taste and unlimited financial resources. Maria had never been to Napa Valley before, and the drive through rolling hills covered with precision-planted grapevines felt like entering a different world entirely. This was wealth at a scale that made even the Davenport mansion seem modest by comparison, a reminder of the vast economic distances that existed even within the upper reaches of American society. "It's beautiful," Nathan observed as their car wound through the estate's entrance gates, "but it's very organized. All the plants are in rows and all the buildings match each other perfectly." "Does that bother you?" Maria asked, recognizing that highly controlled environments sometimes felt oppressive to Nathan's sensory system. "Not bother exactly," Nathan replied thoughtfully. "But it's like someone took all the randomness out of nature and replaced it with math. It might be hard to find quiet spaces if I need them." The observation was typically insightful, suggesting that Nathan had already begun analyzing the environment for potential stressors and coping strategies. Maria made a mental note to help him identify retreat options before the social activities became too intense. Their hosts, James and Keiko Yamamoto, were gracious and welcoming, but Maria could sense their careful evaluation of the family dynamics they were witnessing. James had known Richard for several years through business dealings, but this was his first extended interaction with Nathan and his first meeting with Maria entirely. "Nathan, I understand you're quite an artist," Keiko said during their arrival conversation, clearly trying to find common ground with a child she perceived as challenging. "I'd love to see some of your work sometime this weekend." "I brought my travel art kit," Nathan replied seriously. "Would you like me to draw something about your house? I notice interesting patterns in the architecture that might translate well into geometric compositions." The response was both perfectly polite and utterly authentic to Nathan's way of engaging with the world. Keiko looked slightly puzzled by the formal language and specific artistic focus, but she nodded encouragingly. Maria watched this exchange with the protective alertness of someone monitoring a social situation for potential stress points. She could see that the Yamamoto family was well-intentioned, but somewhat uncertain about how to interact naturally with Nathan's distinctive communication style. The weekend's social activities were carefully planned to showcase both wealth and taste: wine tastings, gourmet meals prepared by a professional chef, tours of local galleries and artisan workshops. For adults accustomed to such luxuries, these events provided pleasant opportunities for conversation and networking. For Nathan, they represented a series of sensory challenges and social demands that required careful navigation. Maria found herself serving as a kind of cultural interpreter, helping Nathan understand social expectations while also helping other adults understand Nathan's needs and responses. When the wine tasting became overwhelming due to strong scents and loud conversation, she quietly suggested that Nathan might enjoy exploring the estate's gardens instead. When other guests asked intrusive questions about Nathan's autism, she provided brief educational responses that satisfied curiosity without violating privacy. "You're very good with him," Keiko observed privately during a moment when Nathan was successfully engaged in sketching the estate's main fountain. "How long have you been working with autistic children?" The question contained multiple assumptions that Maria needed to navigate carefully. Keiko seemed to view Maria as a professional specialist rather than household staff, which was flattering but potentially awkward given the actual nature of her employment arrangement. "Nathan is the first child with autism I've worked with directly," Maria replied honestly. "But I've learned a lot about communication and patience from my own life experiences. Sometimes the most important qualifications can't be earned in school." "That's remarkably wise," Keiko said. "James and I have been wondering if we should seek similar support for our nephew, who has some developmental challenges. The professionals we've consulted seem to focus more on fixing problems than building on strengths." The conversation revealed that Nathan's visible progress and confidence were making an impression on the other adults present, opening possibilities for Maria's approach to influence thinking beyond the immediate family circle. It also suggested that wealthy families across the Bay Area were struggling with similar questions about autism, therapy, and the goals of intervention. But the weekend's most significant challenge came during Saturday evening's formal dinner, when Nathan was expected to participate in extended adult conversation around a table set with multiple courses and elaborate place settings. The combination of social pressure, sensory stimulation, and unfamiliar foods created exactly the kind of situation that had historically triggered Nathan's most difficult behaviors. Maria could see the stress building in Nathan's posture and breathing as the dinner progressed. His responses to questions became shorter and less spontaneous. His hands began moving in the subtle, repetitive patterns that indicated overwhelm, and his eye contact decreased markedly. But instead of the explosive meltdown that might have occurred a year earlier, Nathan turned to Maria and said quietly, "I need a break from the conversation, please." The request was perfectly appropriate and demonstrated remarkable self-awareness, but it also created a small social crisis. How should wealthy hosts respond when a child requests to leave a formal dinner? How should other guests react to what might appear to be rudeness or poor parenting? Richard looked uncertain about how to handle the situation diplomatically. James and Keiko appeared concerned, but unsure about the appropriate response. The other dinner guests waited for social cues about whether Nathan's request should be honored or redirected. However, Maria knew exactly what to do. "Of course, mijo," she said calmly. "Let's step outside for some fresh air, and you can rejoin us whenever you're ready." The response treated Nathan's self-advocacy as reasonable and mature rather than problematic, modeling for the other adults that accommodation could be provided without drama or lengthy explanations. It also demonstrated Maria's comfort with her role as Nathan's support person, regardless of the social setting or audience. Nathan's relief was visible as they stepped onto the terrace overlooking the vineyard. "Thank you," he said simply. "I was running out of words, and my brain was getting too crowded with sounds and smells and people's emotions." "You did exactly the right thing by asking for help," Maria replied. "That shows real growth in self-knowledge." They spent 15 minutes on the terrace, with Nathan sketching the patterns of light and shadow cast by the landscape lighting, while Maria provided gentle companionship. When Nathan felt ready to return to the group, they rejoined the dinner conversation naturally, with no apologies or extended explanations required. The other guests' reaction to this sequence was telling. Instead of viewing Nathan's break as disruptive or inappropriate, several people commented on his mature self-awareness and the effectiveness of Maria's support. James Yamamoto later told Richard privately that he had been impressed by Nathan's communication skills and the respectful way his needs had been accommodated. "Your son is remarkable," James said, "and Maria obviously has a gift for understanding him. You found something that works very well." The validation from Richard's business associates provided external confirmation of what the family had been experiencing internally, that their collaborative approach was producing not just therapeutic progress, but genuine social competence. Nathan was learning to navigate challenging situations while remaining true to his authentic self. But perhaps the weekend's most significant moment came during Sunday morning's informal breakfast, when Nathan spontaneously began explaining his artistic interpretation of the vineyard landscape to a small group of assembled guests. Using his drawing as a visual aid, he described how the geometric patterns of planted grapevines created mathematical relationships that shifted throughout the day as shadows moved across the terrain. "The interesting thing about agriculture," Nathan said with the enthusiasm of someone sharing a fascinating discovery, "is that it's really applied geometry combined with biological timing. Every row has to be precisely spaced for optimal sun exposure, but the plants are living things that grow in organic patterns that can't be completely controlled." The explanation was sophisticated enough that the adults present found themselves genuinely engaged with Nathan's observations rather than simply being polite to a child. He had found a way to share his unique perspective on the world that was both accessible and intellectually stimulating for his audience. Maria watched this interaction with quiet pride, recognizing how far Nathan had come in his ability to connect with others while maintaining his distinctive way of understanding reality. The boy who had once been isolated by his differences was now using those differences as bridges to meaningful communication. The weekend concluded with invitations for return visits and expressions of genuine fondness for Nathan's company. The business celebration had been successful, not despite Nathan's autism, but in some ways because of it. His unique perspectives and honest responses had added depth and authenticity to social interactions that might otherwise have felt superficial. During the drive back to San Francisco, Nathan was unusually talkative, processing the social experiences he had navigated and evaluating his own performance with characteristic self-reflection. "I think I did well with the talking parts," he said, "but I also think I needed Maria there to help translate when my words weren't working properly. Is that okay, or should I practice being more independent?" The question revealed Nathan's growing understanding of social expectations and his thoughtful approach to personal development. He was not simply accepting accommodation as necessary, but evaluating when support was helpful versus when independence was more appropriate. "Both things can be true," Richard replied, showing his own growth in understanding nuanced answers to complex questions. "You should definitely practice independence when you feel ready for it. But it's also smart to ask for help when you need it. Even adults use different kinds of support in different situations." "Maria," Nathan said, turning to address her directly, "thank you for helping me feel safe enough to be myself around new people. I think I want to practice being more independent gradually, but I still want you there for the really hard situations." The conversation represented exactly the kind of collaborative planning that had become characteristic of their family's approach to challenges. Nathan was taking increasing responsibility for his own social development while also recognizing the value of continued support and guidance. For Maria, the weekend had been both rewarding and eye-opening. She had successfully supported Nathan through complex social situations while also gaining confidence in her own ability to interact with wealthy, educated adults as a respected equal rather than a subordinate service provider. The experience had expanded her understanding of her own competence and value, but perhaps most importantly, the Napa Valley weekend had demonstrated that their family's collaborative approach to Nathan's needs was not just privately beneficial, but publicly viable. They had found ways to honor both Nathan's authentic self and social expectations, creating space for inclusion without requiring conformity. As their car crested the hills overlooking San Francisco Bay, the city lights spread out before them like a constellation of possibilities. The weekend had been a test they had passed together, proving that healing and growth could extend beyond private family spaces into the broader social world. Nathan fell asleep during the final stretch of the drive, his sketchbook still open on his lap to a drawing that captured the geometric beauty of the vineyard landscape. In the picture, organized rows of grapevines created mathematical patterns, but organic elements, birds in flight, clouds casting irregular shadows, wildflowers growing at the edges of cultivation, added natural complexity to the design perfection. It was, Maria realized, a perfect metaphor for their family's evolution. Structure and spontaneity, planning and flexibility, individual needs and collective harmony, all working together to create something more beautiful than any single approach could achieve alone. The healing was continuing, expanding, reaching toward new possibilities that none of them had imagined when their journey together first began. As autumn settled over San Francisco, bringing with it the familiar rhythms of the school year and cooler coastal winds, the Davenport family faced a new challenge that would test the foundations of everything they had built together. Nathan was approaching his 11th birthday, and with it, the need to make important decisions about his educational future. Dr. Morrison had recommended that Nathan be evaluated for inclusion in Marin Academy's new program for gifted students with autism spectrum differences, an innovative educational approach that promised to honor both his intellectual capabilities and his neurological needs. The program was highly selective, expensive even by private school standards, and located across the Golden Gate Bridge in a community that would require significant logistical adjustments. But more challenging than the practical considerations were the emotional implications of Nathan potentially leaving his current support system. The collaborative approach that had worked so well within the familiar environment of home and his current school might not translate easily to a new institutional setting with different philosophies and expectations. "I'm excited about the academic possibilities," Nathan told Maria during one of their afternoon conversations, "but I'm worried about having to explain myself to new people all over again. What if the teachers there don't understand my artwork? What if the other students think I'm too weird?" The concerns were entirely reasonable, given Nathan's history of social challenges and his growing awareness of how his differences were perceived by others. The progress he had made in confidence and communication had occurred within relationships that had developed slowly and carefully over many months. "Change is always scary," Maria replied, "but you're much stronger now than you were when I first met you. You know how to ask for what you need, and you know how to explain your thoughts and feelings to other people. Those skills will travel with you wherever you go." But privately, Maria was wrestling with her own concerns about Nathan's potential transition. The new program would likely include professional support staff with advanced degrees in special education and autism intervention. Nathan's teachers would be experts in evidence-based practices and therapeutic approaches that might make Maria's intuitive relationship-based methods seem amateur or unnecessary. More troubling was the possibility that Nathan's success in a professional educational environment might diminish Richard's appreciation for Maria's contributions to his development. If Nathan could thrive under the guidance of credentialed specialists, would Richard conclude that Maria's role had been temporary rather than essential? These worries were amplified by a conversation with Mrs. Henderson, who mentioned that several wealthy families in Pacific Heights had begun hiring professional autism specialists to provide in-home support for their children. "The Weatherbys just brought in someone with a doctorate from Stanford," Mrs. Henderson reported during their shared lunch break. "Very impressive credentials, I'm told. Makes you wonder if that's the direction all these families will be heading." The comment was not directly critical of Maria, but it contained an implicit suggestion that professional trends were moving toward higher levels of formal education and clinical training. Maria understood the subtext. Household staff without advanced degrees might find themselves gradually replaced by specialists with more prestigious qualifications. But Nathan himself seemed unaware of these adult anxieties about professional competition and institutional hierarchies. His focus was on the practical question of how to maintain the relationships and support systems that had become central to his stability and growth. "If I go to the new school," Nathan asked Richard during a family dinner discussion, "will Maria still be able to help me with my artwork and my feelings? Or will I have to get help from strangers who don't know me yet?" The question cut directly to the heart of Richard's own uncertainties about Nathan's educational transition. The Moran Academy program included on-staff counselors and art therapists who were specifically trained to work with gifted autistic students. From a logical standpoint, these professionals should be better qualified to support Nathan's needs than a housekeeper whose expertise had been developed through experience rather than formal training. But Nathan's question also highlighted the irreplaceable value of established relationships and deep personal knowledge. Maria understood Nathan's communication patterns, sensory preferences, and emotional triggers in ways that new professionals would need months or years to develop. The trust they had built could not be quickly replicated, regardless of anyone's credentials or expertise. "I don't think you have to choose between professional support and personal relationships," Richard said carefully. "We can probably find ways to maintain both as you transition to new environments." But even as he offered this reassurance, Richard was aware that the logistics of maintaining Maria's involvement in Nathan's daily life would become more complicated if he enrolled in a program that was geographically distant and professionally comprehensive. The natural boundaries between home support and school support might create pressure to eliminate what could be perceived as redundant services. The dilemma was further complicated by Victoria's perspective on Nathan's educational options. She had been strongly supportive of the Moran Academy program from the beginning, viewing it as evidence that Nathan was moving beyond his early challenges toward mainstream academic success. "This is exactly what we hoped for," Victoria told Richard enthusiastically. "Nathan has developed enough stability and confidence to succeed in a rigorous educational environment with peer-level intellectual challenges. It's a testament to how far he's come." The celebration was well-intentioned, but it contained assumptions about progress and success that troubled both Nathan and Maria. Victoria seemed to view the potential acceptance into the gifted program as evidence that Nathan's autism was becoming less significant or problematic, rather than as evidence that he was learning to navigate the world while remaining authentically himself. "Aunt Victoria talks about my autism like it's something I'm getting over," Nathan observed to Maria with characteristic directness. "But I don't want to get over it. It's part of how I think and see things. I just want to learn how to use it better." The distinction was crucial and revealed Nathan's sophisticated understanding of the difference between accommodation and assimilation. He wanted to develop his capabilities and expand his opportunities without abandoning the neurological differences that contributed to his unique perspectives and abilities. Maria recognized that Nathan's position was both emotionally healthy and potentially challenging within educational and social systems that often prioritize normalization over neurodiversity. The Moran Academy program might be more accepting of differences than traditional schools, but it would still operate within broader cultural expectations about appropriate behavior and academic performance. "That's very wise thinking," Maria told Nathan. "Your autism isn't a problem to solve. It's part of who you are. The goal is learning to be yourself in ways that help you connect with other people and achieve your own goals." But translating this philosophy into practical decisions about Nathan's education required navigating complex institutional requirements and family expectations. Richard found himself caught between wanting to provide Nathan with the best possible academic opportunities and wanting to preserve the support relationships that had been so crucial to his emotional development. The resolution came through an unexpected source, a conversation with James Yamamoto, who had maintained contact with the family since their Napa Valley weekend and had developed genuine fondness for Nathan's company. "I've been thinking about your son's educational situation," James told Richard during a business lunch in downtown San Francisco. Keiko and I have some connections at Marin Academy, and we'd be happy to arrange a meeting with the program director to discuss how Nathan's current support system might be integrated into his academic experience. The offer was generous and potentially transformative. Instead of viewing Maria's relationship with Nathan as conflicting with professional educational services, James was suggesting that the two approaches might be complementary rather than competitive. The program director, Dr. Sarah Chen, is actually quite progressive about family involvement and alternative support systems, James continued. She understands that autistic students often have complex needs that require creative solutions rather than standardized approaches. The possibility of maintaining continuity between Nathan's home support and school support opened new avenues for thinking about his educational transition. Rather than choosing between Maria's relationship-based approach and the Academy's professional services, they might be able to combine both approaches in ways that enhanced Nathan's overall development. Dr. Chen proved to be even more open-minded than James had suggested. During their initial consultation meeting, she listened carefully to descriptions of Nathan's progress over the past year and asked thoughtful questions about the collaborative methods that had proven most effective. We've found that students with autism spectrum differences thrive when they have consistent support across different environments, Dr. Chen explained. If Nathan has developed effective relationships with support people at home, we'd certainly want to find ways to maintain and build upon those connections. The conversation revealed that Marin Academy's approach to autism support was more flexible and individualized than Richard had expected. Rather than implementing standardized interventions, they developed customized support plans that incorporated each student's existing strengths and relationships. "Would it be possible for Maria to visit the campus and meet with your staff?" Richard asked. "She knows Nathan's communication patterns and sensory needs better than anyone, and I think her input could be valuable for developing his support plan." Dr. Chen's enthusiastic agreement to this proposal marked a turning point in thinking about Nathan's educational future. Instead of a transition that would necessarily disrupt established relationships, they were now planning an expansion that would incorporate Maria's expertise into a broader professional support network. When Maria first visited the Marin Academy campus, she was struck by the thoughtful design elements that accommodated sensory sensitivities, natural lighting, acoustic treatments that reduced echo and background noise, flexible seating options that allowed students to choose comfortable positions for learning. The environment felt welcoming rather than institutional, creative rather than rigid. "This is beautiful," Nathan said during his campus tour, immediately gravitating toward the art therapy room with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Marine Hills. "I could do really good work in a space like this." The art therapy room was supervised by Ms. Jennifer Walsh, a licensed therapist who had specialized in autism and creativity for over 15 years. When she saw Nathan's portfolio of artwork, her response was immediate and enthusiastic. "This is extraordinary work," Ms. Walsh told Richard and Maria privately. "Nathan's use of symbolism and geometric patterns shows remarkable sophistication. I'd love to learn more about how he's developed these techniques." The comment was directed as much toward Maria as toward Richard, acknowledging her role in Nathan's artistic development. Ms. Walsh seemed genuinely interested in understanding the collaborative methods that had helped Nathan develop his creative voice. "Maria has been instrumental in helping Nathan see his artwork as communication rather than just personal expression," Richard explained. "She's taught him to think about audience and meaning in ways that have really expanded his confidence." "That's exactly the kind of approach we try to foster here," Ms. Walsh replied. "We believe that autistic students often have unique insights and capabilities that can be developed through relationship and understanding rather than remediation. The philosophical alignment between Nathan's home support and the Academy's educational approach suggested that the transition might enhance rather than disrupt his development. but the practical details of maintaining Maria's involvement still required careful planning and clear communication about roles and responsibilities. After several meetings and collaborative planning sessions, they developed an innovative arrangement that would allow Nathan to attend Marin Academy while maintaining his supportive relationship with Maria and his ongoing work with Dr. Morrison. Maria would visit the campus regularly to consult with Nathan's teachers about his progress and provide insights about effective communication strategies. She would continue her expanded role in his home environment, helping him process school experiences and maintain emotional balance. Most importantly, Nathan would have input into all decisions about his support services, ensuring that his voice remained central to planning his own educational experience. "I want to try the new school," Nathan announced after visiting the campus and meeting with potential teachers and classmates. "But I want Maria to still be part of my team, and I want to be able to come home and talk to her about everything that happens there." The request was both reasonable and revealing. Nathan understood that growth often required taking risks and embracing new challenges, but he also understood that security and stability provided the foundation that made risk-taking possible. "That sounds like an excellent plan," Richard replied. "We'll make sure you have both new opportunities and familiar support as you take on this challenge." The decision to enroll Nathan in Marin Academy while maintaining Maria's expanded role in his life represented a successful synthesis of competing values and approaches. Professional expertise and personal relationship, institutional resources and family support, individual growth and emotional security, all were recognized as valuable and necessary. But perhaps most significantly, the process of making this decision had demonstrated the family's commitment to collaborative problem-solving and respect for Nathan's own voice in determining his future. He was not simply a passive recipient of adult decisions about his education and care, but an active participant in planning his own development. As they prepared for Nathan's educational transition, Maria felt a sense of satisfaction that went beyond personal job security. The family had chosen to value her contributions even when other options were available, recognizing that relationships and understanding could not be easily replaced by credentials or institutional services. Nathan's success would continue to require many different kinds of support from many different people, but the foundation of trust, communication, and respect that they had built together would remain constant, providing stability as he navigated new challenges and opportunities. The autumn light streaming through the mansion's windows seemed brighter than before, illuminating new possibilities for growth and connection that honored both Nathan's unique gifts and his ongoing need for understanding and support. Winter brought unexpected news that would test the Davenport family's newly established harmony in ways none of them had anticipated. Richard received a lucrative offer to relocate his business operations to Austin, Texas, where a consortium of investors wanted to establish a new cryptocurrency trading platform that would take advantage of Texas's favorable regulatory environment and lower operating costs. The opportunity was financially compelling, potentially worth tens of millions of dollars in additional assets and positioning Richard as a pioneer in an emerging market. But it would require relocating the entire family to a city where they had no established connections, no familiar support systems, and no history of community involvement. "It's an incredible opportunity," Richard told Maria during one of their regular conversations about Nathan's progress. "But I'm torn about disrupting Nathan's stability just when he's doing so well at Marin Academy." The dilemma was immediate and complex. Nathan had been attending the academy for 3 months and was thriving academically and socially in ways that exceeded everyone's expectations. His artwork was being featured in student exhibitions, his academic performance was exceptional, and he had begun developing genuine friendships with classmates who shared his interests in mathematics and creative problem-solving. But the business opportunity in Austin represented the kind of career advancement that Richard had been working toward for years. The cryptocurrency industry was rapidly evolving, and being positioned at the forefront of new developments could set him up for long-term financial security, that would benefit Nathan throughout his lifetime. "What does Nathan think about potentially moving?" Maria asked, instinctively focusing on the person who would be most affected by any major life change. "I haven't told him yet," Richard admitted. "I wanted to get more information about the opportunity and think through the implications before presenting it as a real possibility. But I know I need to include him in the discussion soon." The conversation revealed Richard's growth as a parent. His instinct now was to consider Nathan's needs and perspectives rather than making unilateral decisions based solely on adult priorities. But it also highlighted the ongoing tension between providing stability for Nathan and pursuing opportunities that might benefit the family's long-term interests. When Richard finally discussed the potential move with Nathan, the boy's response was characteristically thoughtful and complex. Instead of immediately rejecting the idea or expressing enthusiastic support, Nathan asked detailed questions about what the change would mean for various aspects of his life. "Would I be able to continue working on my art projects with the same techniques Ms. Walsh is teaching me?" Nathan asked. "Would there be schools in Austin that understand autism the same way Marin Academy does? Would Maria be able to come with us? Or would I have to start over with new support people?" The questions demonstrated Nathan's sophisticated understanding of the factors that contributed to his success and well-being. He was not simply resistant to change, but rather evaluating whether a major transition could preserve the elements of his current situation that were most important to his continued development. Maria listened to this conversation with growing anxiety about her own future. The possibility of the family relocating to Texas raised immediate questions about whether her expanded role would survive such a dramatic change. Austin had its own population of domestic workers, potentially people with more experience serving wealthy families in the emerging tech industry. Richard might view a cross-country move as an opportunity to hire locally and establish new household management systems rather than maintaining California-based staff. But more troubling than concerns about employment was the possibility of losing her relationship with Nathan at a crucial point in his development. They had worked together for nearly 18 months to build communication patterns and trust that had become central to his sense of security and self-confidence. The thought of abandoning that relationship for practical reasons felt like a betrayal of everything they had accomplished together. Nathan seemed to sense Maria's concerns without them being explicitly stated. "If we move to Austin," he said directly, "I want Maria to come with us. I know there are probably other people in Texas who could help me, but Maria already knows how my brain works, and I trust her to help me figure out new situations." The statement was both touching and practically complicated. Relocating Maria to Austin would require providing housing, covering moving expenses, and potentially offering increased compensation to justify the disruption to her own life and community connections in San Francisco. "That's definitely something we could discuss," Richard said carefully, clearly unprepared for the logistics of such an arrangement. "But we should also think about whether this move would be good for all of us, not just the business opportunities it might create." The family spent the following weeks researching educational options in Austin, investigating the local support services for children with autism, and gathering information about the social and cultural environment they would be entering. The more they learned, the more complex the decision became. Austin offered excellent educational opportunities, including several programs specifically designed for gifted students with learning differences. The city's tech industry had attracted families dealing with similar challenges, creating a community of resources and expertise that might rival what they had found in the Bay Area. But Austin also represented a significant cultural change from San Francisco, more politically conservative, less socially diverse, potentially less accepting of unconventional approaches to family life and child rearing. The collaborative support model they had developed might face greater skepticism or resistance in a region where traditional professional boundaries were more rigidly maintained. "I'm worried about the social environment," Victoria confided to Richard during a private conversation. "San Francisco can be quite progressive about alternative approaches to education and therapy. Texas might be more traditional in their expectations about how families should operate. The concern was diplomatically stated, but clearly referenced potential problems with Maria's expanded role in Nathan's care. In a more conservative social environment, the sight of a Latino housekeeper functioning as an integral member of a wealthy family service team might attract unwelcome attention or criticism. But Nathan's perspective on the cultural differences was characteristically direct and insightful. Every place has some people who are kind and some people who are prejudiced, he observed. The question is whether there are enough kind people to create a good community for our family. The statement reflected Nathan's growing understanding of social dynamics and his remarkable ability to focus on essential truths rather than getting lost in surface details. His autism had not prevented him from developing sophisticated insights about human behavior and social systems. As winter progressed toward spring, Richard found himself increasingly torn between the business opportunity in Austin and the family stability they had worked so hard to establish in California. The financial benefits of the move were undeniable, but the emotional costs were difficult to calculate and potentially severe. The decision point arrived when the Austin investors set a deadline for Richard's commitment to their project. If he was going to relocate his business operations, the transition would need to begin immediately to meet their development timeline. "I need to give them an answer by Friday," Richard told his family during a dinner discussion. "This is probably the biggest financial opportunity I'll ever have, but I don't want to sacrifice Nathan's well-being or our family's happiness for money." Nathan listened to his father's summary of the situation with the careful attention he gave to complex problems that required thorough analysis. Then, he asked a question that surprised everyone with its sophistication. "Dad, are you worried about the business opportunity because you think it's the right thing to do for our family, or because you're afraid of missing out on something that sounds exciting?" The question forced Richard to examine his motivations more honestly than he had been willing to do independently. Was the Austin opportunity genuinely beneficial for his family's long-term interests, or was it primarily appealing because it represented professional validation and increased net worth? After several minutes of thoughtful consideration, Richard provided an answer that revealed significant personal growth. "I think it's mostly about not wanting to miss out on something that sounds exciting," he admitted. "We're already financially secure, Nathan is thriving in his current environment, and our family relationships are stronger than they have ever been. The Austin opportunity would be professionally satisfying, but it wouldn't necessarily make our lives better in ways that actually matter." The acknowledgement marked a fundamental shift in Richard's priorities, from treating financial success as an end in itself to viewing it as one tool among many for creating family well-being. Nathan's needs and the relationships that supported his development had become more important than abstract business opportunities. "So we're staying in San Francisco?" Nathan asked, clearly hoping for confirmation of what seemed to be emerging as the preferred decision. "We're staying in San Francisco," Richard replied. "This is where we've built our community and our support systems. This is where you're succeeding academically and socially. This is home." The decision to remain in California rather than pursue the Austin opportunity represented more than a lifestyle choice. It was an affirmation of the values that had guided the family's healing process. Relationships mattered more than opportunities. Stability was more valuable than novelty. Success was defined by wellness and connection rather than solely by financial metrics. Maria felt profound relief at the decision to stay, but also deep gratitude for the way it had been reached. Richard had not dismissed the Texas opportunity lightly or chosen California simply because change seemed difficult. Instead, he had thoughtfully evaluated what would genuinely serve his family's interests and made a decision that prioritized their collective well-being. "Thank you," Maria told Richard privately after the family discussion had concluded. "I know refusing that opportunity wasn't easy, and I appreciate that Nathan's stability was part of your decision-making process." "Nathan's stability and your role in supporting it," Richard replied. "Moving to Austin would have meant starting over with so many things that are working well here. That seemed like a poor trade-off for money we don't actually need." The conversation reflected the complete transformation of Richard's relationship to wealth and success. Early in their acquaintance, he had viewed financial opportunities as inherently valuable, regardless of their impact on family life. Now he understood that money was only useful insofar as it contributed to the things that genuinely mattered: health, relationships, personal growth, and a meaningful contribution to the world. Spring's arrival in San Francisco felt like a celebration of the decision to remain rooted in the community where they had all found their footing. Nathan's artwork began incorporating themes of home and belonging, with drawings that showed the same figures appearing in multiple familiar locations across the city. Maria's own confidence continued growing as she established deeper connections within Nathan's school community and expanded her understanding of autism support and advocacy. Most significantly, Richard began exploring ways to use his business success to support other families dealing with similar challenges. He investigated funding opportunities for autism research, educational programs, and family support services that could benefit children and parents throughout the Bay Area. "I want to use what we've learned to help other families who are struggling with some of the same issues we faced," Richard explained to Nathan and Maria. "Maybe we can create opportunities for other children to receive the kind of understanding and support that made such a difference for you." The philanthropic impulse represented the natural evolution of personal healing into social contribution. Having experienced the power of relationship-based support and collaborative problem-solving, Richard wanted to make similar resources available to families who might not otherwise have access to them. Nathan's response to his father's philanthropic interests was characteristically supportive and insightful. "That's good thinking, Dad. A lot of autistic kids probably feel lonely and misunderstood like I used to feel. If we can help them find people who see their strengths instead of just their struggles, that would be really important." The conversation confirmed that Nathan's own growth had included developing empathy and social awareness that extended beyond his immediate family circumstances. His autism had not prevented him from caring about other children facing similar challenges or wanting to contribute to solutions that might help them. As the family settled into their decision to remain in San Francisco and build upon the community connections they had established, Maria reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this point. 18 months earlier, she had been hired as household staff in a family struggling with grief, isolation, and misunderstanding. Now she was a valued member of a collaborative support team that had helped Nathan develop confidence and social skills, while also helping Richard become a more emotionally attuned and thoughtful parent. The transformation had not been easy or predictable. There had been moments of conflict, misunderstanding, and genuine uncertainty about whether their unconventional approach would ultimately serve Nathan's best interests. But they had worked through each challenge by maintaining focus on Nathan's well-being and trusting in their growing understanding of each other's perspectives and capabilities. Now, as they looked toward Nathan's continued education and development, Maria felt confident that they had established a foundation strong enough to support whatever new challenges and opportunities might arise. The relationships they had built, the communication skills they had developed, and the collaborative problem-solving approaches they had learned would serve them well regardless of what the future might bring. The mansion's rooms, once echoing with loneliness and grief, now hummed with the productive activity of a family engaged in meaningful work together. Nathan's artwork covered the walls in carefully curated displays that celebrated his unique vision while also marking his developmental progress. Richard's home office included space for family collaboration sessions and educational planning meetings. Maria's role had expanded to include a dedicated workspace where she could research autism support strategies and maintain communication with Nathan's educational team. Most importantly, the house felt like a home, a place where each person's authentic self was welcomed and valued, where challenges were addressed through patience and creativity, where growth was supported through understanding and encouragement. The San Francisco fog continued its daily dance around the mansion's windows, but inside, the atmosphere was warm and bright with possibility. Three people from very different backgrounds had found ways to support each other's healing and growth, creating a model of family life that honored both individual needs and collective well-being. Their story was far from over. Nathan would continue growing and developing. Richard would continue learning and evolving as a parent. Maria would continue discovering new ways to contribute her gifts and insights to meaningful work. But they had established a foundation of trust, respect, and collaborative problem-solving that would support whatever adventures and challenges lay ahead. The healing had taken root and was continuing to grow, season by season, relationship by relationship, small victory by small victory, toward a future bright with promise and possibility. 1 year later, as San Francisco's autumn fog began its familiar embrace of the city's hills and neighborhoods, the Davenport family prepared to celebrate Nathan's 12th birthday, with a gathering that would have been unimaginable when Maria first walked through the mansion's gates 30 months earlier. The celebration was not elaborate by Pacific Heights standards, no professional party planners or imported entertainment, but it was rich with the kind of thoughtful attention to relationships and meaning that had become characteristic of the family's approach to important occasions. Nathan had requested that the party include not just family friends, but also several of his classmates from Marine Academy, his teachers, Ms. Walsh and Dr. Chen, Dr. Morrison, and the household staff who had become integral to his daily life. "I want everyone who helped me learn to be myself to be part of celebrating who I've become," Nathan explained, with the articulate self-awareness that had developed through years of collaborative reflection on his own growth and development. The guest list represented a constellation of relationships that reflected Nathan's expanding world, while honoring the foundational connections that continued to provide security and support. Maria found herself preparing for the party not as household staff serving wealthy employers, but as a valued family member whose contributions to Nathan's development were recognized and celebrated by everyone present. The afternoon's activities were carefully designed around Nathan's preferences and sensitivities. Small group conversations rather than large crowd interactions, hands-on creative projects rather than passive entertainment, comfortable indoor and outdoor spaces that allowed guests to move freely according to their own social energy levels. Nathan had collaborated on every aspect of the planning, ensuring that the celebration would be genuinely enjoyable rather than simply impressive. But the party's most significant moment came when Nathan presented a special art project he had been working on for several months, a large collaborative mural that depicted his understanding of community, support, and the interconnectedness of relationships that had shaped his journey toward self-acceptance and social confidence. The mural was executed in Nathan's characteristic style of geometric patterns and symbolic representations, but it incorporated elements that clearly referenced the specific people and experiences that had been most meaningful in his development. Maria appeared as a bridge figure connecting different areas of the composition, while Richard was depicted as a strong foundation supporting various structural elements. Dr. Morrison, Ms. Walsh, and other significant adults were represented as different kinds of tools or resources, each contributing unique capabilities to the overall construction project. "This is my map of how people help each other," Nathan explained to his assembled guests. "I used to think that getting help meant admitting that I was broken or couldn't do things myself. But now I understand that everyone needs help with different things, and helping each other is how we build communities where everyone can contribute their gifts." The explanation was accompanied by detailed descriptions of the symbolic elements in the mural, with Nathan demonstrating the sophisticated visual vocabulary he had developed for representing complex emotional and social concepts. His autism had not disappeared or been overcome, but it had become a source of unique insights and capabilities that enriched his relationships and contributions to his community. Dr. Chen, observing Nathan's presentation alongside his other teachers and family members, was visibly moved by the depth of self-understanding and social awareness reflected in both the artwork and Nathan's explanation of its meaning. "Nathan, this is extraordinary work," she said. You've created something that helps all of us understand how support systems function and how individual growth happens within the context of caring relationships. This could be valuable for other students and families who are navigating similar journeys. The suggestion that Nathan's personal insights might benefit others marked another milestone in his development, recognition that his unique perspective on autism, support, and community could contribute to broader conversations about neurodiversity and inclusive education. But perhaps the afternoon's most touching moment came when Nathan presented Maria with a smaller, companion piece to the main mural, a detailed portrait that showed her not as she might appear in a photograph, but as she existed in Nathan's understanding of their relationship. The image depicted Maria as a figure composed of interconnected patterns that suggested both strength and gentleness, surrounded by symbols representing patience, wisdom, and the particular kind of love that sees potential in situations where others see only problems. "This is how you look to me," Nathan told Maria as he presented the artwork. "Not just your outside appearance, but your inside qualities that help me learn to trust myself and other people." Maria accepted the portrait with tears in her eyes, understanding that it represented not just Nathan's artistic skill, but his profound appreciation for the relationship they had built together. The boy who had once been overwhelmed by social interaction was now creating sophisticated visual tributes to the people who had supported his growth. Richard, watching this exchange between his son and the woman who had become central to their family's healing, felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond pride in Nathan's development. He had learned to recognize and value the kinds of intelligence and contribution that could not be measured in traditional academic or professional terms. Maria's gift for understanding and nurturing Nathan's authentic self had been as crucial to his progress as any formal therapy or educational intervention. But the celebration also marked important growth in Richard's own understanding of parenting, success, and the goals of family life. Instead of viewing Nathan's autism as a problem to be solved or overcome, Richard had learned to appreciate it as one aspect of his son's complex and remarkable personality. Nathan's differences were not obstacles to overcome, but qualities to understand and accommodate within the context of loving relationships and supportive community. A year ago, I was worried that Nathan's autism would limit his opportunities and happiness, Richard reflected during his brief remarks to the assembled guests. "I've learned that limitations often come from other people's assumptions and inflexibility, not from neurological differences themselves. Nathan has taught me that success means being able to contribute your authentic gifts to a community that values what you have to offer." Victoria, who had initially been skeptical of the collaborative approach to Nathan's support and Maria's expanded role in the family, found herself genuinely moved by the afternoon's celebrations and the evident happiness and confidence Nathan displayed in his interactions with guests. "I have to admit that I was wrong about some things," she told Maria privately during a quiet moment in the kitchen. "I was so focused on professional credentials and traditional boundaries that I almost missed the real healing that was happening right in front of me. Nathan is thriving, and you've played a crucial role in making that possible." The apology was gracious and reflected Victoria's own growth in understanding the sources of effective support and the value of relationships that transcended conventional employer-employee boundaries. She had learned to recognize competence and contribution regardless of their institutional context or formal credentials. As the celebration continued into the evening, with small groups of guests engaged in various activities throughout the mansion's public spaces, Maria found herself reflecting on the transformation that had occurred not just in Nathan's life, but in her own understanding of her capabilities and value. 30 months earlier, she had been hired as domestic help in a wealthy household, expected to clean and organize while remaining largely invisible to the family members she served. Now, she was recognized as an integral member of a collaborative team whose insights and expertise were valued by educators, therapists, and parents dealing with similar challenges. The change had not happened overnight or without difficulty. There had been moments of conflict, misunderstanding, and genuine uncertainty about whether their unconventional approach would serve Nathan's best interests. But through patient persistence and willingness to learn from experience, they had created something unprecedented, a model of family support that honored both professional expertise and personal relationship, individual needs, and collective well-being. Perhaps most importantly, Nathan himself had emerged as a confident, articulate young person whose autism was integrated into his identity rather than defining it as a limitation or deficit. He understood his own needs and could advocate for himself effectively. He had developed meaningful friendships with peers who appreciated his unique perspectives and capabilities. He was beginning to see ways that his different way of experiencing the world might contribute to solutions for problems others hadn't even recognized. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Nathan made a point of personally thanking each person who had attended, expressing specific appreciation for their individual contributions to his development and well-being. His social skills had evolved far beyond simple politeness to include genuine emotional intelligence and sophisticated understanding of how relationships function. "Thank you for helping me learn that being different doesn't mean being wrong," Nathan told Dr. Morrison during their farewell conversation. "And thank you for listening when I had ideas about my own treatment that were different from what the textbook suggested. Thank you for teaching me that the best therapy happens when we trust the expertise that comes from lived experience as much as the expertise that comes from professional training," Dr. Morrison replied, clearly moved by Nathan's gratitude and his own memories of their collaborative journey. Similar conversations took place throughout the evening as Nathan demonstrated his growing ability to recognize and articulate the specific ways different people had contributed to his growth. His autism had not prevented him from developing deep appreciation for human relationships and sophisticated understanding of how support systems function effectively. When the last guests had departed and the mansion had returned to its familiar evening quiet, the family gathered in the kitchen where so many of their important conversations had taken place over the past 30 months. Nathan was tired but exhilarated by the day's social interactions. Richard was reflective about how much their family had changed since Maria's arrival, and Maria was quietly satisfied by the evidence that their collaborative approach had created lasting positive change. "I have something I want to tell you," Nathan announced as they shared a simple meal together. "Ms. Walsh thinks my artwork is sophisticated enough that I might be able to have a real exhibition sometime soon, not just at school, but at a gallery where other people could see it and maybe understand autism better." The possibility of Nathan's art reaching a broader audience was exciting, but also somewhat daunting. Public exposure would require Nathan to navigate social situations and potential criticism from people who might not understand or appreciate his unique perspective. "How do you feel about that possibility?" Maria asked, instinctively focusing on Nathan's emotional readiness rather than the practical logistics of organizing an exhibition. "I think it would be good," Nathan replied thoughtfully. "If my pictures can help other autistic kids feel less alone or help parents understand their children better, then sharing them seems important. And I'm not afraid of people who don't understand, because I know who I am and I have people who support me." The confidence reflected in Nathan's response marked the culmination of everything they had worked to achieve together. Nathan had developed not just coping skills or social behaviors, but genuine self-acceptance and the security that comes from knowing you are valued for your authentic self. As they prepared for bed that night, each family member carried with them a sense of completion and new beginning. They had successfully navigated the most challenging period of their relationships and had emerged stronger, wiser, and more connected than any of them had imagined possible. Nathan fell asleep, surrounded by birthday cards and small gifts from his friends, but also with his latest art project spread across his desk, a new drawing that showed pathways extending from his current community toward unknown but promising destinations. The future was still uncertain, but it was bright with possibility. Maria returned to her own apartment in the Mission District, carrying Nathan's portrait, and a profound sense of satisfaction about work that had genuine meaning and impact. She had found ways to use her life experiences, intuitive understanding, and hard-won wisdom to make a real difference in the life of a remarkable young person and his family. Richard stood at his study window, looking out over the San Francisco Bay and thinking about the journey that had brought his family from isolation and grief to connection and hope. The business opportunities he had sacrificed to maintain their stability seemed insignificant compared to the wealth of relationships and understanding they had gained through their collaborative healing process. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift, revealing glimpses of the city lights that stretched toward the bay and beyond. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but they would face them together, with the confidence that comes from having learned to trust each other's strengths and support each other's growth. The healing was complete in some ways, and just beginning in others. Nathan would continue developing and discovering new aspects of his capabilities and interests. Richard would continue learning and evolving as a parent and community member. Maria would continue finding new ways to contribute her gifts and insights to meaningful work. But they had established something lasting, a model of family life based on mutual respect, collaborative problem-solving, and the understanding that healing happens through relationship rather than in isolation. Their story was proof that people from different backgrounds and circumstances could find ways to support each other's growth when they were willing to look beyond surface differences to the common humanity that connected them all. And you, have you ever worked for someone who learned from you without saying it out loud? Have you ever been part of healing that happened so gradually you almost didn't notice it was occurring? Tell me your story in the comments. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe so it reaches another woman who needs hope today. For more heartfelt stories about the hidden strength of working people, the quiet dignity of service, and the healing power of seeing people for who they truly are, click the link on the left. Thank you for walking this emotional road with us, for believing that every person has value regardless of their circumstances, and for understanding that sometimes the most important victories happen in moments when no one is watching. We'll see you in the next story, where we'll explore again how love learns to express itself across differences of class, education, and expectation, and how healing often begins with a single person brave enough to see potential where others see only problems. Until then, remember that your work matters, your wisdom has value, and your capacity to heal and strengthen others is a gift that this world desperately needs. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you soon.